I spent 8 years building the relationships that secured my family a $1 billion empire in Japan. Then my own brother fired me at a public gala, tossing a severance package on my dinner plate so they could hand my commission to a woman whose only qualification is a translation app on her phone. I did not scream or beg. I simply smiled and walked away. They had no idea that the very contract they snatched from my hands was legally worthless without me. Before I share the exact details of how their greed led to their ultimate destruction, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had your unshakable loyalty repaid with calculated betrayal. My name is Josephine, and I am 33 years old. For almost a decade, I operated as the invisible backbone of Miller Holdings. We were a commercial real estate titan based in New York, but the polished, successful exterior of our family business hid a deeply fractured and toxic core. The Plaza Hotel ballroom hummed with clinking crystal and wealthy investors celebrating the 30th anniversary of our family enterprise. Women in silk gowns and men in tailored tuxedos moved gracefully across the marble floors under warm crystal chandeliers. I stood near the VIP table, feeling entirely disconnected from the joyous celebration around me. My eyes burned with a dry ache, and my fingers were numb from relentless typing. I had not slept a single minute in over 72 hours. Instead of resting, I had been locked in my cramped office translating and formatting final legal addendums for a massive $1.5 billion commercial real estate acquisition with Saito Industries. This was not a routine contract. It was the culmination of 8 years of my life. I had dedicated my youth to mastering the Japanese language, learning strict cultural protocols, and understanding the subtle nuances of international negotiation that my father and older brother completely ignored. They viewed business as a battlefield where whoever shouted loudest automatically won. I knew that Mr. Kenji Saito, the CEO of Saito Industries, required respect, honor, and mutual understanding before he would sign away $1 billion. I had spent countless nights awake accommodating the time difference, smoothing over my brother, arrogant mistakes, and building a solid bridge of trust that Miller Holdings desperately needed to survive in the Asian market. I held the stack of premium paper tightly against my chest. The documents felt incredibly heavy, holding the weight of my sacrifices, my lost weekends, and my relentless desperation to finally earn my family genuine approval. I truly thought tonight would be the night everything changed. I believed with all my heart that handing them the finalized, flawless contract would force them to finally see my value. I imagined my father standing at the podium, acknowledging my vital role as the primary cultural liaison in front of all our investors. I genuinely believed the $500,000 commission I had rightfully earned would be my ticket to financial independence and a permanent respected seat at the executive table. That fragile hope completely shattered the moment I saw my older brother Preston approaching my table. Preston was 35, but carried himself with the unearned swagger of a man who had been handed the world on a silver platter without having to work for it. As vice president, he wore a custom tuxedo and a predatory grin that instantly made my stomach knot with anxiety. Walking perfectly in step with him was Bianca, his new fiancée. Bianca had been a junior marketing assistant for barely 6 months before Preston proposed. She was the kind of woman my family valued, loud, flashy, and perfectly willing to step on anyone to elevate her own position. I forced a polite smile onto my tired face, preparing to hand Preston the completed documents so he could review them before the formal presentation. But Preston did not greet me. He did not ask how I was doing after pulling 3 all-nighters for his benefit. He did not even offer a simple thank you. Instead, he reached out and violently snatched the heavy stack of translated files directly from my hands. The sudden aggressive force caused the edge of the paper to slice sharply against my index finger, leaving a deep, stinging paper cut. I gasped, slightly, rubbing my bleeding finger against my thumb, but Preston did not even look at the small bead of crimson blood forming on my skin. He was too busy admiring the pristine documents he had done absolutely nothing to prepare. Then he reached into the inner breast pocket of his expensive tuxedo jacket and pulled out a thick, stiff manila envelope. He held the envelope directly over my empty dinner plate and casually let it drop. The heavy thud of the package hitting the fine china seemed to echo over the classical music playing softly in the background. I looked down at the table. My full name was printed across the front of the envelope in cold, stark black ink beneath the return address of our corporate human resources department. My heart began to pound a slow, painful rhythm against my ribs as confusion washed over me. "Your services are no longer required," Josephine Preston announced. His voice was not lowered for privacy or family discretion. He spoke loudly, deliberately, projecting his words, so the surrounding executives, investors, and waitstaff could hear every single humiliating syllable. "Pack your desk by midnight tonight. We are giving the $500,000 liaison commission to Bianca." The air in my lungs completely vanished. I stood frozen in the center of the glittering ballroom, surrounded by wealthy people who were pretending to look away while eagerly hanging on to every word of my public degradation. I looked from the termination envelope resting on my plate to my brother's incredibly smug face. I had sacrificed my 20s to build this company international reputation. I had saved Preston from catastrophic cultural blunders in Tokyo more times than I could possibly count. I had single-handedly built the very foundation of the billion-dollar deal he was currently holding in his hands. And he was firing me in public just to humiliate me and steal the money I had worked for. I slowly turned my stunned gaze away from my brother and looked at Bianca. I expected to see at least a flicker of surprise or perhaps uncomfortable pity on her face. Instead, she was practically vibrating with malicious triumph. She stood tall beside Preston, looking down at me as if I were a piece of dirt on her designer shoes. Without saying a word, she slowly raised her right hand, holding up her expensive smartphone. The screen was glowing brightly in the dim romantic lighting of the ballroom. Displayed clearly on her phone for me to see was a popular free-language translating app open and ready to use. It was a silent, taunting declaration that my 8 years of specialized expertise, my deep cultural knowledge, and my relentless loyalty were entirely worthless to them and easily replaced by a simple piece of software. I stood there, letting the harsh reality of Bianca holding up that screen sink into my exhausted bones. The bright light from her phone illuminated the sheer arrogance on her face. "Do not be so dramatic, Josie," she said, waving her perfectly manicured hand in the air, as if brushing away a mildly annoying insect. "It is just translation work. I took 2 semesters of Japanese in college, and my app can handle the rest. We really do not need to pay out $500,000 to family for something a machine can do in 5 seconds." Her voice carried that distinct tone of privileged condescension that I had grown to despise over the last few months. She genuinely believed that negotiating a billion-dollar international real estate acquisition was the same as ordering sushi at a local restaurant. She had no concept of the strict cultural protocols, the complex hierarchical structures, or the subtle unspoken communication required when dealing with traditional Japanese executives. To her, my 8 years of dedicating my life to this company, my endless nights studying the delicate layers of corporate respect, and my careful mediation of every single mistake my brother had ever made over there meant absolutely nothing. I felt a cold hollowness spreading through my chest as I looked away from Bianca and turned my gaze toward the head of the table. I looked directly at my father Charles, expecting him to step in and put an end to this humiliating spectacle. He was the chief executive officer of Miller Holdings, the patriarch of our family, and the man whose approval I had spent my entire adult life desperately trying to earn. I searched his familiar stern face for any sign of objection, any flicker of paternal protection, or even basic professional common sense. Surely he understood that handing over the most critical communication of the most important deal in our company history to an inexperienced assistant with a phone app was corporate suicide. Instead, my father simply looked back at me with a completely blank expression. He did not reprimand Preston for his aggressive behavior, or correct Bianca for her staggering ignorance. He reached out and picked up his crystal champagne glass, catching the light from the chandeliers above. Preston is the visionary who secured this deal with Saito Industries, my father stated, his voice echoing clearly across the sudden quiet of our immediate surroundings. He built the aggressive strategy that brought them to the table. We need a modern, strong American team to push this through to the final signing next week. We do not need a glorified secretary who bows too much and slows down the negotiations with unnecessary traditions. Take the severance and go, Josephine. The words felt like a physical blow to my stomach. A glorified secretary who bows too much. That was how my own father viewed the countless hours I had spent salvaging this deal. When Preston had drunkenly insulted Mr. Saito's senior advisors in a Tokyo hotel lobby, I was the one who had stayed awake for 14 hours performing intense damage control to keep the investors from walking away. When my father sent overly aggressive emails demanding immediate signatures, I was the one who carefully translated and softened the aggressive demands into respectful business inquiries, saving our family from utter ruin. I had been the shield protecting Miller Holdings from its own destructive arrogance, and now my father was publicly stripping away my dignity, reducing my entire career to a demeaning stereotype just to elevate his golden son. The betrayal ran so deep, it felt as though the floor beneath me had completely vanished. I looked at the three of them standing there bathed in the warm glow of the celebration they felt they had earned. Preston with his unearned swagger holding the documents I had painstakingly prepared. Bianca with her smug, victorious smile, believing she had just easily stolen my massive commission. And my father, the man I had sacrificed my youth to impress, looking at me as though I were nothing more than an easily discarded employee who had overstayed her welcome. They truly believed they had won. They truly believed they were invincible and that I was completely powerless against them. A strange and sudden calmness began to wash over me, replacing the crushing pain of rejection. It was a cold, detached clarity that sharpened my senses and slowed down my racing heart. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice or beg my father to reconsider. I knew in that exact moment that no amount of logic or pleading would ever penetrate their monumental hubris. They had made their choice, and they were entirely convinced of their own superiority. I slowly reached out and placed my hand on the thick manila severance envelope resting on my dinner plate. The paper felt heavy and rough against my skin. As I picked it up, my eyes drifted to the stack of translated documents Preston was clutching so proudly against his chest. Because he had snatched them from me so violently, the top page had shifted slightly, revealing a section of the original Japanese text, alongside my careful English translation notes. I stared at the intricate black characters printed on the crisp white paper. It was a highly specific legal addendum drafted by Mr. Saito's personal legal team, outlining the core requirements for mutual corporate respect and ongoing fiduciary trust. In the Japanese business world, words carry layers of hidden meaning that shift depending on the context, the relationship, and the social standing of the parties involved. The specific kanji used in that paragraph expressed a profound concept of unbreakable personal honor and lifelong commitment that transcended standard business practices. I knew immediately that a basic language translation app would strip away all of that necessary nuance. It would take those deeply traditional, respectful characters and translate them literally into cold, aggressive legal demands. It would turn a delicate request for mutual understanding into what sounded like a hostile ultimatum. If Bianca attempted to use her phone to navigate the final addendums, she would unknowingly insult the entire Japanese delegation in the most unforgivable way possible. She would shatter the complex foundation of honor I had spent 8 years carefully constructing. But as the top page shifted, I noticed a narrow cross-reference printed beside the Japanese text, followed by a set of initials from Mr. Saito's legal counsel. It was the kind of notation Preston would never pause long enough to examine. To him, the document was already a trophy. To me, the mark suggested that the final appendices contained a condition important enough to be separately verified before the agreement could move forward. I did not reach for the papers or warn him. The ballroom was the worst possible place to examine a dense legal provision, and Preston's grip on the file made it clear that he would interpret any question as another attempt to interfere. I simply memorized the reference number and the location of the notation. My personal encrypted copy of the contract was waiting in my car, complete with every appendix and counsel note. For the first time that evening, I stopped seeing the severance envelope as a weapon aimed at me. It was evidence of a decision they had made without understanding the document in their hands. Whether the overlooked provision was merely inconvenient or completely destructive, I would confirm it privately. Until then, I would let them continue celebrating. I looked back up at Preston and Bianca, and then finally at my father. I felt the sharp sting of the paper cut on my finger, but it no longer mattered. The pain of their betrayal was already fading, replaced by the quiet certainty of what was about to happen to them. They wanted to navigate a ruthless international business deal without me. I decided I would gladly let them try. I held the severance envelope tightly in my hand, feeling the thick documents inside that outlined the end of my tenure at Miller Holdings. The finality of the moment settled over me like a heavy blanket, but the stifling heat of my earlier panic was completely gone. I observed the way Preston puffed out his chest, looking around the room to ensure the other executives were watching his display of power. I noticed how my father took another slow sip of his champagne, completely dismissing my presence, as if I had already packed my things and vanished from his life. The sheer magnitude of their impending destruction was almost beautiful to contemplate. They were about to leverage the entire family fortune on a deal they had fundamentally misunderstood. They were going to walk into a room with Kenji Saito, armed with nothing but unearned confidence and a free mobile application, expecting a proud traditional billionaire to hand them his wealth. They had spent my entire life treating me as though I were disposable and ugly duckling in a family of aggressive corporate sharks. Now they had voluntarily thrown away their only safety net. I did not need to fight them for my position. I did not need to scream about how unfair it was that Bianca was stealing my $500,000 commission. I simply needed to step aside and watch them walk directly off the cliff they had built for themselves. The silence between us stretched for another long moment. I let them savor their false victory, allowing them to believe they had finally put me in my place. I tightened my grip on the manila envelope, accepting the severance they were forcing upon me. I knew that by the time next Friday arrived, they would realize the catastrophic magnitude of their mistake, but it would be far too late to fix it. For the first time, freedom felt less like a loss than a door opening directly in front of me. Preston, Bianca, and my father watched me closely, their expressions a mix of aggressive triumph and eager anticipation. They wanted tears. They wanted me to beg for my job, to plead for the commission I had spent months earning. I did not give them the satisfaction. The cold, detached clarity that had settled over my mind deepened, steadying my hands. Instead of raising my voice, I reached up to the lapel of my tailored blazer. My fingers found the cold metal clip of my corporate identification badge. The small plastic square bearing the Miller Holdings logo suddenly felt weightless. I unclipped it smoothly and placed it flat on the pristine white tablecloth. With a slow, deliberate motion, I slid the badge across the polished surface. It glided over the linen and stopped right next to the manila severance envelope. The harsh clatter of plastic hitting fine china broke the heavy silence in our corner of the room. I picked up my evening purse from the chair beside me, ensuring my movements were graceful and unhurried. I smoothed the fabric of my dark dress, taking a slow, steady breath that filled my lungs with absolute liberation. Then I looked directly into the eyes of Preston and let a smile spread across my face. It was a chilling, serene expression of absolute certainty. It was the smile of someone holding a royal flush while watching her opponent proudly bet everything on a pair of twos. I saw the immediate, involuntary shift in his posture. Preston shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his broad shoulders tensing under his custom tuxedo jacket. The smug, unearned victory on his face faltered quickly, replaced by a flash of profound confusion. My quiet, icy composure completely disarmed him. He did not know how to fight an enemy who refused to go to war, an enemy who already knew she had won. "Congratulations on the deal, Preston," I said. My voice was steady and perfectly modulated, carrying just enough volume to be heard clearly over the ambient noise of the gala, without sounding strained. "I truly hope your app knows how to navigate the complicated honor protocols of Mr. Saito." I did not wait for his response. I turned on my heel and began walking toward the grand exit of the Plaza Hotel ballroom. I kept my head held high, my shoulders back, and my posture immaculate. The string quartet was playing a lively, uplifting waltz, creating a stark contrast to the destruction that had just occurred at the VIP table. I felt the curious eyes of the other executives following me, the quiet, speculative whispers rippling through the wealthy crowd as they witnessed the daughter of the chief executive officer calmly walking out. But for the very first time in my life, the judgment of the elite social circle of my family meant absolutely nothing to me. With every step I took across that expansive marble floor, the crushing weight of their expectations lifted from my shoulders. For years, I had walked through these ballrooms, trying to shrink myself, trying to be invisible, so I would not cast a shadow over the golden boy image of Preston. I passed the towering champagne fountains and the elaborate glittering ice sculptures stepping out of the bustling ballroom and into the quiet, carpeted hallway. They were left behind in that room, thoroughly confused by my eerie calm, completely unaware that the ticking time bomb of their own hubris had just been activated. I walked to the elevator banks, pressed the down button, and waited in the serene silence of the corridor. When the doors opened, I stepped inside and rode the car down to the underground parking garage. The cool, damp air of the concrete structure was a welcome relief from the stifling atmosphere of the gala. The garage was mostly silent and empty, the harsh neon overhead lights casting long, dramatic shadows across the rows of luxury vehicles. I walked steadily to my sensible sedan, a car that had always been a point of endless mockery for my image-obsessed family, and unlocked the doors. Slipping into the driver's seat, I closed the door firmly and let the absolute isolation of the vehicle wash over me. I did not start the engine right away. The adrenaline was finally beginning to ebb, leaving behind a sharp, focused energy. I reached into the back seat and retrieved my personal encrypted laptop from my heavy leather briefcase. I powered it on the bright glow of the screen illuminating the dark interior of my car and casting a blue light across my face. My fingers flew across the keyboard with practiced precision, entering the complex sequence of security passwords required to access my local personal files. I completely bypassed the Miller Holdings network servers, relying entirely on the offline backups I had meticulously maintained. I pulled up the digital copy of the finalized Saito Industries contract. The document was hundreds of pages long, a dense labyrinth of financial stipulations, real estate zoning laws, and international trade agreements. I scrolled past the massive monetary figures that had so easily blinded my father and brother to reality. I navigated straight to the very end of the document, diving deep into the dense, highly nuanced legal language of the final appendices. I found exactly what I was looking for. I highlighted the text on my screen, staring intently at Appendix 4, Section B. It was explicitly titled the Key Personnel Clause. I read over the English translation I had carefully drafted and negotiated just 2 days ago. The clause stated in absolute legally binding terms that the entire $1.5 billion financing structure was inextricably tied to my continued presence as the fiduciary mediator. It detailed that Kenji Saito was engaging in this massive financial commitment based solely on the mutual trust, cultural respect, and personal honor established specifically with me over the past 8 years of relentless correspondence. It explicitly stated that if I were to be removed from the negotiation, replaced by another representative, or terminated from my role as the primary liaison, the contract would be considered a direct insult to the Saito family honor. Most importantly, it stated that my removal would instantly render the multi-billion-dollar financing agreement legally void. There was no grace period built into the text. There was no renegotiation clause for my family to fall back on. There was absolutely no loophole for Preston or the expensive corporate lawyers of my father to exploit. By formally handing me that manila severance envelope and publicly terminating my employment in front of their peers, they had legally detonated their own monumental deal. The contract they were so eager to sign was now nothing more than a worthless stack of paper. I closed my laptop with a soft, satisfying click and rested my hands on the steering wheel. A genuine laugh escaped my lips, echoing softly in the car. They had thrown me away because they believed I was easily replaceable. They had no idea what was coming. The trap was set. They were about to learn the hardest, most expensive lesson of their entire lives. They thought they could discard me, but they had just signed their corporate death warrant. Their empire would crumble within the week, and I would be watching. I pulled out of the underground parking garage and merged into the late-night Manhattan traffic. When I finally unlocked the door to my apartment, I walked straight down the hallway to my home office, guided by the soft amber glow of the streetlights filtering through the blinds. This room had been my sanctuary, and my prison for 8 years. Piles of market research, cultural analysis folders, and translation dictionaries covered almost every available surface. It was time to clear it all away. I pulled a stack of boxes from the closet and began the process of packing. My hands brushed against a thick acrylic plaque resting on the edge of my bookshelf. It was a replica of the Top Salesman of the Year award. Preston had proudly dumped it on my desk 6 months ago, telling me to keep it as a reminder of what real success looked like. I picked up the heavy block of plastic, feeling the engraved letters of his name. A bitter laugh escaped my throat as the memory of how he actually earned it came flooding back. It was during our critical initial summit in Kyoto 2 years ago. We had spent 3 days in delicate preliminary negotiations with the senior advisors of Mr. Kenji Saito. I had meticulously prepped Preston on the absolute necessity of patience and humility. I begged him to understand that aggressive American closing tactics would be seen as a deeply offensive sign of disrespect. Preston completely ignored me. On the final evening of the summit, he drank far too much premium sake during a highly formal dinner. He loudly demanded that the Japanese executives stop stalling and sign the preliminary letters of intent. When they politely hesitated, Preston slammed his hand on the low wooden table, spilling tea across the tatami mats, and declared that Miller Holdings was doing them a massive favor by even considering their properties. The silence that followed was absolute and terrifying. The Saito advisors simply stood up, bowed silently, and walked out of the room. They were prepared to walk away from a deal worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Preston barely seemed to notice the catastrophic damage he had caused. He stumbled back to the lobby of our hotel, complaining about the rigid customs before literally passing out on a velvet sofa near the elevators. I covered him with a coat and left him there sleeping off his arrogant mistakes. I spent the next 14 hours fighting desperately to salvage our company reputation. I sat on my knees in a private meeting room, pouring tea and bowing until my back ached. I spoke in the most formal registers of the Japanese language, taking the full weight of the dishonor upon myself to protect my family name. I explained that my brother was young and overwhelmed. I carefully smoothed over his reckless, drunken insults, translating his aggressive demands into polite requests for mutual corporate growth, while praying they would not walk away. It was grueling work that required every ounce of my cultural knowledge. By the time the sun rose over Kyoto, I had managed to pull them back from the edge. They agreed to continue the negotiations entirely because of my dedication to honor and respect. When we returned to New York, I was physically sick from exhaustion. I walked into the massive glass doors of the corporate headquarters, expecting at least a small private acknowledgement of exactly what I had done to single-handedly save the entire company. Instead, my father called an immediate mandatory meeting for the executive floor. I stood in the back of the crowded boardroom as my father proudly raised a glass of expensive scotch. He beamed at Preston, announcing to the entire company that his son was a brilliant visionary. My father praised Preston for his aggressive negotiation tactics, claiming his bold approach was exactly what was needed to break through the Asian market. The room erupted in applause. Preston smiled, taking full credit without a single trace of shame. As the applause died down, my father caught my eye. I waited, holding my breath, hoping for just one sentence of validation. Instead, my father gestured vaguely in my direction with his Scotch glass. He told the room that they should also thank the administrative support team, specifically Josephine, for managing the complicated flight itineraries and making sure the coffee orders were correct. He reduced my 14 hours of agonizing diplomacy to booking flights and fetching beverages. I remember walking out of the boardroom feeling as though a piece of my soul had permanently hardened. I looked down at the acrylic award in my hand back in the present moment. Without a single second of hesitation, I dropped the plaque directly into the heavy black trash bag beside my desk. It landed with a satisfying thud, burying itself under discarded files and empty ink cartridges. I moved on to the next dusty shelf, taking my time and carefully sorting through the remaining scattered remnants of my long, unappreciated career. I packed my reference books, my specialized dictionaries, and the framed photographs of the Tokyo skyline I had taken during my rare moments of free time. Finally, I reached the center of my desk, where a small, locked display case rested. I unlocked the glass door and gently removed a hand-painted Japanese tea set. The delicate porcelain was midnight blue, adorned with subtle gold accents. It was a breathtaking piece of artistry, but its true value came from its origin. It was a rare, deeply personal gift given to me directly by CEO Kenji Saito after our third successful negotiation summit. In the Japanese corporate world, a gift of this magnitude from a chief executive to a liaison is a profound statement of absolute trust. It was Mr. Saito acknowledging that he saw my value even when my own family treated me like a disposable servant. I wrapped each delicate cup in thick layers of protective tissue paper, treating the porcelain with the reverence it deserved. I placed the teapot securely in the center of a reinforced box, making sure it was completely insulated against any potential damage. This tea set was not just a beautiful object. It was tangible proof that my 8 years of dedication had meant something real. It was proof that while my family was busy building a house of cards, I had been forging relationships built on solid, unbreakable granite. As I taped the final box shut, the silence of my apartment was broken by the sharp buzzing of my personal cell phone on the kitchen counter. The vibration rattled against the granite, demanding my attention. I walked over and picked up the device, expecting it to be an automated alert or an email from a confused colleague. I unlocked the screen and looked at the notification banner. My heart skipped a surprised beat. It was a text message, but it was not directed to me. It was a frantic capitalized message sent from the private Miller family group chat. Preston had accidentally included my old personal number in a thread meant strictly for the executive board. I silently stared at the screen, reading the panicked words over and over again as the sheer magnitude of their stupidity washed over me. The message thread was a chaotic flurry of corporate directives and arrogant boasting. Preston had typed out a command to the chief financial officer, demanding that the wire transfers be authorized immediately. "We lock down the downtown commercial properties today," Preston wrote, his digital words dripping with the same unearned confidence he had displayed at the gala. "Saito is a guaranteed done deal. Tell the bank to release the funds right now." My father responded a few seconds later, validating the reckless command. "The $300 million bridge loan is officially approved," my father typed. "The family estate and the Manhattan corporate headquarters have been pledged as collateral. Proceed with the acquisitions immediately." I stood frozen in the quiet shadows of my kitchen, clutching the phone tightly in my hand. A bridge loan. They had actually taken out a massive short-term, high-interest bridge loan to aggressively buy up properties before the Japanese financing was officially secured. It was a staggering display of financial recklessness. In the commercial real estate world, Bridge loans are incredibly dangerous financial instruments designed to cover immediate costs until permanent financing comes through. The interest rates are astronomical, and the terms are utterly unforgiving. If the primary deal falls through, the lenders have the immediate legal right to seize whatever collateral was used to secure the loan. My phone buzzed again, pulling my attention away from the glowing screen. This time, it was not an accidental text message, but a direct phone call. The caller ID displayed the name of David, an older senior financial analyst at Miller Holdings, who had always treated me with genuine professional respect. I did not answer the call. I simply could not bring myself to speak to anyone from that building right now. I let it ring until it went to voicemail. A minute later, a notification popped up indicating David had left a message. I tapped the screen and pressed the phone to my ear, listening to the frantic, anxious voice of one of the few decent people left in my family company. Josephine, I know you were let go, and I am so incredibly sorry. David began, his voice hushed, as if he were hiding in a supply closet to make the call. But you need to know what your father and brother are doing. They have completely lost their minds. They are moving forward with the commercial purchases right now. They are bypassing the standard escrow period because they want to beat a rival developer to the prime downtown locations. David took a shaky breath on the recording, and I could hear the genuine terror in his voice. They used everything, Josephine. Charles put up the entire Miller family estate in Connecticut as collateral. They pledged the corporate headquarters building and completely drained their personal liquid assets to secure a $300 million bridge loan from a private equity firm. They are acting like the Saito money is already sitting in our bank accounts. I tried to warn them that the Japanese delegation has not signed the final binding agreements yet, but Preston yelled at me and told me to process the paperwork. Please tell me you have some leverage over this deal. Please tell me they know what they are doing. The voicemail ended with a soft click, leaving me alone with the heavy silence of my apartment. I slowly lowered the phone and walked over to my kitchen island, pulling out one of the leather bar stools and sitting down. I needed a moment to fully process the catastrophic mistake they had just made. My father and brother were entirely blinded by their own arrogance. They genuinely believed that they were untouchable titans of industry. They assumed that the $1.5 billion deal with Saito Industries was an absolute certainty. In their minds, the Japanese executives were nothing more than walking automated teller machines who would simply show up to the signing ceremony and rubber stamp whatever documents were placed in front of them. They did not respect the rigid honor codes of international business. They did not understand that a preliminary letter of intent was merely a foundation of trust, not a legally binding guarantee of capital. And because they possessed zero cultural awareness, they had no idea how quickly that fragile trust could evaporate. I opened my laptop again, the bright light of the screen waking me up from my temporary shock. I navigated to the financial news networks and logged into the commercial real estate wire feeds that tracked major property acquisitions in real time. I sat in the darkness of my kitchen, hitting the refresh button every few minutes, watching the live updates stream across my monitor. Within an hour, the news officially broke. Several financial publications published alerts confirming that Miller Holdings was aggressively sweeping up prime commercial real estate in the downtown district. The articles praised my father and brother for their bold market moves, noting their impending partnership with Saito Industries as the financial muscle behind the massive acquisitions. The business world was celebrating their aggressive strategy, completely unaware that the entire foundation of their empire was built on a legally void contract. I watched the real estate acquisitions go live on the wire, feeling a profound sense of awe at their sheer stupidity. They had collateralized their entire existence. The sprawling Connecticut estate where I had grown up feeling like an unwanted guest was now heavily mortgaged to a ruthless private equity firm. The prestigious Manhattan corporate headquarters, where they had publicly humiliated me just hours ago, was entirely leveraged. If the Japanese financing did not clear their accounts by the deadline, those lenders would immediately trigger a default. The banks would swoop in and seize everything my family owned, liquidating their legacy to cover the massive debt. They had assumed that cutting me out of the company was a brilliant strategic move that would save them my $500,000 commission. They thought they were eliminating a weak link in their corporate chain. Instead, their unearned confidence had pushed them into taking a $300 million gamble with absolutely no safety net to break their fall. They believed they were asserting their dominance and proving that they did not need my specialized skills to succeed in a complex international market. I leaned back in my chair and looked at the glowing screen, tracking the millions of dollars my family was currently spending in real time. They had just handed me the very rope they would use to hang themselves. The intricate trap was perfectly set, and they had walked directly into it with eager, arrogant smiles on their faces. They had staked their entire fortune on a deal that legally required my participation to survive. The clock was now ticking toward their inevitable total destruction. I felt a deep, settling peace wash over me as I closed my laptop for the night. I did not need to actively seek revenge or plot a complicated scheme to destroy them. All I had to do was step back and allow their own breathtaking incompetence to run its natural course. They had built a towering, fragile empire of debt and hubris. They had deliberately discarded the only person capable of holding the fragile architecture of their business together. I just had to wait for gravity to take hold and let the entire structure come crashing down around them. By morning, I no longer felt like a victim waiting for justice. I felt like a witness waiting for consequences. The following morning brought a profound tranquility. I woke up naturally without the harsh blare of an alarm clock reminding me of a mandatory dawn conference call with Tokyo. I walked into my kitchen and brewed a fresh cup of coffee, savoring the quiet stillness. For the first time in my professional life, my phone was not constantly vibrating with urgent demands from my father or aggressive complaints from my brother. I was separated from the chaos of Miller Holdings, but still had a clear window into their rapid descent. Around 10 o'clock in the morning, my laptop pinged with a secure incoming message from David. Despite his intense fear of professional retaliation, the senior financial analyst was simply too terrified of the impending corporate collapse to keep his head down. He sent me an encrypted file containing the raw video recording of the preliminary digital conference that had taken place just an hour prior. I clicked the link and watched the footage load on my screen, taking a slow sip of coffee as the video began to play. The camera showed the grand executive boardroom of our Manhattan headquarters. Preston was sitting right at the head of the massive mahogany table, looking incredibly smug in his tailored designer suit. Bianca sat directly beside him, playing the role of the vital international liaison, despite looking completely and utterly out of her depth. On the large digital monitors mounted on the wall, the senior advisory team from Saito Industries appeared. They were sitting in their Tokyo offices, maintaining the formal posture that Japanese corporate etiquette demanded. I felt a familiar knot of secondhand embarrassment form in my stomach as the meeting commenced. I had spent years carefully coaching my brother on the extreme importance of soft, respectful introductions and polite small talk before diving into strict financial figures. Preston foolishly ignored all of it. He did not formally bow his head to show respect. He did not offer any customary gratitude for their valuable time. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished table, and launched directly into demanding a firm timeline. He mispronounced the name of the lead senior advisor twice, calling him casually by his first name instead of using his title. I could see the subtle stiffening of the shoulders of the Japanese executives, a physical reaction that telegraphed their deep discomfort. Then came the devastating moment that absolutely sealed their financial fate. Preston gestured to Bianca, instructing her to clearly convey the core philosophy of their new working relationship. He wanted to express that Miller Holdings was seeking a long-term partnership built firmly on mutual corporate respect. It was a highly standard, polite phrase that I had meticulously translated dozens of times in our previous successful negotiations. Bianca smiled confidently and quickly picked up her exceptionally expensive smartphone. She tapped the screen, opening her free language translating application, and spoke the English phrase loudly and slowly into the sensitive microphone. I leaned closer to my monitor, watching in absolute disbelief as she held the phone up to the microphone. The robotic, automated female voice echoed clearly through the high-quality speakers in Tokyo. I listened closely to the Japanese translation the basic application had generated, and my jaw practically dropped in shock. The software had completely failed to grasp the delicate, nuanced corporate context of the vocabulary words. Instead of providing the respectful business terminology for mutual harmony, it had selected an aggressive slang combination. The app had literally translated their friendly intent into a deeply threatening phrase that essentially meant we demand your absolute submission in this hostile corporate takeover. It was a catastrophic linguistic and cultural failure. In traditional Japanese business culture where respect and honor are paramount, speaking to a billionaire investor using the aggressive demanding terminology of a street thug was an absolutely unforgivable insult. I watched the screen intensely as the senior advisors of Mr. Saito completely froze in their expensive chairs. Their polite, accommodating expressions vanished instantly, replaced by cold, hard masks of absolute shock and profound, deep offense. In their eyes, Preston and Bianca had just spat directly in the face of their corporate legacy. Any competent liaison would have instantly recognized the sudden drop in temperature in the virtual room. I would have immediately bowed, apologized profusely for the improper phrasing, and spent the next 20 minutes gracefully repairing the severely damaged honor of our esteemed guests. But Bianca simply smiled proudly at the camera, completely oblivious to the massive insult she had just delivered. She genuinely believed she had flawlessly nailed the difficult translation. Preston foolishly compounded the fatal error by continuing his aggressive verbal assault. Instead of pausing to let the automated translation settle, he began tapping his expensive metal pen loudly against the tabletop, creating a harsh, impatient, frustrating rhythm. He interrupted the senior Japanese advisor who was attempting to seek polite clarification regarding the shocking and aggressive translation. Preston raised his voice, talking loudly over the respected elder statesman. "We need to actively speed this process up, gentlemen," Preston said, his loud tone dripping with arrogant impatience. "The market is moving incredibly fast, and we do not have time to sit around endlessly debating old tradition. We have already secured our end of the real estate properties, so we fully expect the finalized wire transfers by this Friday. Let us just skip all the tedious formalities and just get the final paperwork signed today." I actually had to pause the video and close my tired eyes. He had treated the trusted emissaries of a global billionaire like lazy, inconvenient subordinates who were actively wasting his precious, valuable time. He had demanded speed over precision, which was the ultimate sign of a weak, unreliable business partner to the Saito executives. The sheer, concentrated, staggering ignorance of my older brother was breathtaking to witness. The recorded video ended abruptly shortly after that embarrassing display. The Japanese delegation had simply stated with cold politeness that they would meticulously review the proposed terms, and they ended the connection without a single traditional closing pleasantry. My phone buzzed again, pulling my focused attention away from the dark laptop monitor. David had sent a follow-up text message containing a freshly forwarded company email thread. The message had just been sent to the entire executive board by Preston himself. I opened the email and carefully read the incredibly arrogant celebratory words my brother had confidently typed. The subject line was written entirely in capital letters, proudly declaring that the massive deal was securely locked and officially finalized. Preston falsely boasted to the entire company that his aggressive modern negotiation tactics had worked absolutely perfectly. He wildly claimed he had shown the Japanese investors true, strong American leadership and effectively put them exactly in their place. Below his blind, arrogant boasting was the original email that had just been sent directly from the prestigious legal department of Saito Industries. It was a single, incredibly crisp line of precise Japanese text. Preston proudly assumed this translation meant "we will see you soon," anticipating the formal signing. I stared at the original characters on my screen, feeling absolute certainty wash over me. Bianca and her app had failed completely. The specific ancient phrase did not mean a friendly meeting. It was a formal traditional declaration of permanently and fully severed honor. The phrase carried a finality that no convenient translation could soften. I leaned back in my ergonomic desk chair and let out a long, slow breath. The absolute finality of those ancient characters was staggering. In the aggressive American corporate world, a severed contract usually meant a fierce renegotiation or a temporary strategic cooling-off period before returning to the table. In the deeply traditional circles of Tokyo corporate elite, it meant that Miller Holdings was effectively dead to them. There would be no second chances. There would be no emergency digital conference calls to smooth things over. The esteemed Saito delegation had respectfully closed the heavy door and locked it forever. And the most beautiful, deeply satisfying part of this entire disaster was that my father and brother were currently popping expensive champagne in their Manhattan penthouse, completely blind to the fact that they were celebrating their own funeral. I spent the rest of the weekend enjoying a profound sense of peace that I had not felt since I first started working for the family business 8 years ago. I went for long, leisurely walks through Central Park, watching the leaves rustle in the gentle wind. I visited my favorite local bakery and bought a fresh, warm pastry without worrying about checking my email every 2 minutes for a crisis. The toxic, anxious energy that used to govern my every waking moment was entirely gone. I was just a spectator now, watching a highly predictable, multi-million-dollar train wreck unfold in glorious slow motion. When Monday morning arrived, the harsh reality of the situation finally began to sink its sharp teeth into the pristine glass walls of Miller Holdings. I sat at my kitchen island with a fresh cup of coffee, watching the internal company drama play out through the frantic updates David was sending me. He was practically giving me a live play-by-play of the escalating confusion on the executive floor. According to David, Preston had marched into the office that morning, expecting a signed digital copy of the preliminary agreements waiting patiently in his inbox. Instead, he found nothing but empty digital space. Bianca had attempted to follow up on the cryptic email she had completely mistranslated. She sent out 3 separate calendar invitations for a virtual signing ceremony, expecting the Saito legal team to eagerly accept her proposed times. One by one, the automated system pinged back with immediate harsh rejections. There was no polite explanation attached to the declined invitations. There was no courteous request to reschedule for a more convenient time or apologies for a scheduling conflict. The Japanese executives simply hit decline and went completely dark. The silent treatment is a well-known and highly effective tactic in international negotiations, but this was entirely different. This was not a strategic pause designed to gain leverage or test the waters. This was an absolute crushing vacuum of communication. By Tuesday afternoon, the silence had stretched into a deafening roar that began to rattle the thick glass windows of the executive boardroom. Preston had his junior assistants calling the Tokyo offices directly, but the receptionist politely informed them that the senior advisors were indefinitely unavailable. The calls were never transferred. The voicemails were never returned. Bianca sat rigidly beside him, quietly realizing that the authority he had promised her offered no protection when his decisions began to fail. Panic is a fascinating thing to observe in people who firmly believe they are invincible. Through David, I learned that the atmosphere at the corporate headquarters had rapidly shifted from arrogant celebration to a tense, suffocating anxiety. My father was pacing the halls of the executive suite, demanding answers that no one on his modern aggressive team could provide. He kept asking Preston why the Saito legal team was suddenly stalling the process. Preston, of course, absolutely refused to take any responsibility for the breakdown in communication. He blamed the international time difference. He blamed technical glitches with the email servers. Instead of realizing that he had made a catastrophic cultural mistake, Preston allowed his wounded, fragile ego to dictate his next move. He was a man who had never been told no in his entire privileged life, and he simply could not handle being ignored by people he viewed as subordinates. He convinced himself that the Japanese delegation was playing hardball trying to squeeze better financial terms out of Miller Holdings at the 11th hour. He decided that the only way to handle their silence was to show them who was truly in charge of the acquisition. David forwarded me the exact email Preston sent to the Saito executive team on Wednesday morning. I read the words on my screen and actually felt a cold chill run down my spine. It was a masterpiece of corporate self-destruction. Preston had completely abandoned any pretense of professional courtesy. He did not use any formal titles or respectful greetings. He drafted a deeply aggressive, threatening message demanding immediate compliance. "We have accommodated your rigid schedules long enough," Preston wrote in the email to the billionaire investors. "We are moving forward with massive commercial acquisitions on our end, and we do not have the patience to sit around while you play games with the timeline. You are wasting our time and holding up vital capital. If we do not have the finalized signed agreements in our possession by Friday morning, we will reconsider our partnership and seek funding elsewhere." I stared at the screen in absolute disbelief. He had actually threatened to walk away from a $1.5 billion investment. He gave a hostile ultimatum to a man who possessed more wealth, influence, and global power than our entire family line combined. Preston thought he was projecting strength and dominance. He thought he was proving that aggressive American business tactics were vastly superior to polite, outdated traditions. He had absolutely no idea that he had just taken a massive canister of gasoline, poured it over the burnt ashes of their relationship, and dropped a lit match. The response from Tokyo was exactly what I knew it would be. Absolute, total, unforgiving silence. They did not dignify his aggressive ultimatum with a reply. They simply let his arrogant, disrespectful words hang in the empty digital space between New York and Japan. While Preston strutted around the office bragging to the junior staff about putting his foot down, my father was beginning to experience the crushing physical weight of the financial trap they had set for themselves. Charles was a ruthless businessman, but he was not completely ignorant of basic mathematics. The terrifying reality of the massive bridge loan they had taken out was finally starting to set in. David's next voice memo did not repeat the size of the loan. Instead, he described the meeting in which the chief financial officer finally forced my father to confront the clock. A projection filled the boardroom screen showing interest charges climbing in real time, while the company's available cash moved in the opposite direction. Every hour of silence from Tokyo narrowed their remaining options. Charles demanded that the finance team unwind several property purchases. The answer was immediate and humiliating. The acquisitions had been rushed through at premium prices, and reversing them now would require accepting enormous losses. Potential buyers had already sensed distress and were submitting offers far below what Miller Holdings had paid. Selling would not solve the problem. It would simply make the collapse visible sooner. Then my father asked the only question that mattered. "How long do we have?" According to David, the chief financial officer hesitated before answering. The first default trigger would activate at 9 o'clock on Monday morning. Until then, the firm could continue operating, but only on paper. Payroll transfers were being delayed. Routine vendor payments required executive approval. Senior analysts had begun quietly removing personal belongings from their desks because they no longer believed the building would remain under Miller control. Charles ordered everyone to remain silent and threatened termination for anyone who discussed the company's condition outside the executive floor. The command only confirmed what the staff already understood. Miller Holdings was no longer managing an expansion. It was trying to conceal a countdown. Preston responded by insisting that his ultimatum would force Saito Industries back to the table before the weekend. My father wanted to believe him, but the numbers on the screen refused to cooperate. For the first time in his career, Charles could not intimidate a balance sheet, dismiss a deadline, or order someone else to absorb the consequences. He could only watch the cost of his confidence rise minute by minute. The tense atmosphere inside the thick glass walls of the Miller Holdings executive suite had officially shifted from tense anxiety into complete, unfiltered chaos. I sat comfortably at my kitchen island, miles away from the destruction, sipping my coffee, as David sent me another encrypted audio message. He had locked himself in an empty conference room on the lower floor just to safely record the update. Through the audio file, I could hear the muffled but distinct sound of my father shouting. Charles Miller was not a man who ever lost his temper in the office. He viewed raising his voice as a sign of weakness, a loss of executive control. But the sheer terror of the $300 million bridge loan had completely shattered his carefully maintained professional facade. According to David, my father had stormed into the vice president's suite and slammed the door behind him, demanding to know why the Japanese delegation was treating his ultimatum with absolute silence. Preston reacted exactly the way he always did when backed into a corner. He aggressively deflected all responsibility. Even through the heavy soundproof glass walls, the junior staff could hear him shouting back at our father. He arrogantly insisted that the Japanese executives were just being stubborn and archaic. He claimed they were trying to test his resolve and that backing down now would show weakness. He paced the length of his expensive office, refusing to admit that his hostile email had been a catastrophic miscalculation. When my father demanded to know why the initial communication had broken down so terribly during the video conference, Preston immediately threw his fiancée directly under the bus. He pointed his finger at Bianca, blaming her entirely for the translation errors. He told my father that Bianca had completely bungled the digital meeting by relying on a cheap mobile application instead of properly preparing the materials. Bianca had been sitting in the office when the screaming match began. The illusion of her glamorous, powerful new role evaporated in an instant. Preston did not defend her or protect her as his future wife. He sacrificed her to save his own skin without a single second of hesitation. David described watching Bianca run out of the executive suite with tears streaming down her face, clutching her expensive designer purse as she fled toward the elevators. Her perfectly manicured facade was ruined. The golden couple of Miller Holdings was already beginning to turn on each other under the crushing weight of their impending bankruptcy. They were discovering that loyalty built on unearned privilege shatters easily when actual consequences arrive. While my father and brother were busy tearing each other apart in the executive suite, the junior members of the legal department were desperately scrambling to find a lifeline. Charles had ordered the entire legal team to scour the preliminary agreements, looking for any possible loophole. They were searching for a penalty stipulation they could use to legally threaten Saito Industries into responding. A junior legal aide named Evan was assigned to review the final appendices of the contract. Evan was only a year out of law school, and he was terrified of making a mistake. He sat at his cubicle, painstakingly reading through the dense legal jargon that I had carefully translated and formatted just a week prior. He was looking for any clause that would give Miller Holdings leverage over the silent billionaires in Tokyo. Evan reached the final appendices expecting to find a technical remedy, but a cross-reference stopped him. It linked the financing agreement to a personnel schedule filed with the international mediation documents. He opened the schedule, checked the named representative, and then pulled the company's termination record from the internal system. My name appeared in both places. At first, Evan assumed the dates had to be wrong. He compared the timestamp on my termination notice with the effective date of the financing papers. Then he checked the board authorization that Preston had signed after the gala. The sequence was undeniable. Miller Holdings had removed the designated liaison before the final execution of the agreement and had formally recorded that decision in its own corporate system. Evan called a senior attorney into his cubicle and asked him to review the cross-reference without explaining why. The attorney read it once, stopped, and quietly closed the office door. A second lawyer was summoned. Then the head of legal arrived. Within minutes, the search for leverage against Saito Industries had become an internal investigation into how the executive team had invalidated its own position. No one wanted to carry the documents upstairs. Evan finally gathered the relevant pages, attached the termination record, and walked toward the executive suite. David saw him pass through the accounting floor with the stiff posture of someone transporting something dangerous. By the time he reached Preston's office, the shouting between my father and brother could be heard through the walls. Evan entered without waiting to be invited. He placed the documents on the desk in chronological order and pointed first to the personnel schedule, then to my termination notice. He did not repeat the entire clause. He only told my father that the company's legal team had verified the consequence and that no demand threat or revised translation could reverse what had already been triggered. The room went silent before Charles even began to read. The silence that fell over the executive office was sudden and absolute. My father slowly picked up the papers. He read the clause once and then read it again. The color completely drained from his face as the horrifying truth finally penetrated his arrogance. He looked at the specific provisions stating that removing me from the negotiation process would instantly void the entire $1.5 billion agreement. He looked at the stark, undeniable fact that they had voluntarily triggered this exact clause when they publicly fired me at the anniversary gala. Every single arrogant decision they had made over the past week had been a nail in their own coffin. Preston stopped his aggressive pacing and looked at my father, confused by the sudden silence. He asked what the document said, but my father did not answer him. Charles just stood there staring at the printed words holding the physical proof of his own catastrophic mistake. He realized that the massive bridge loan, the mortgages on their corporate headquarters, and the heavy liens against the family estate were all secured by a deal that no longer existed. The entire future of Miller Holdings, the legacy he had spent 30 years building, and the very roof over his head were legally shackled to the daughter he had spent a lifetime treating like a disposable servant. He had publicly humiliated me in front of absolutely everyone at the prestigious anniversary gala. He had blindly allowed his beloved golden son to violently snatch my hard work and hand my rightfully earned commission to an entirely unqualified assistant. He had coldly commanded me to take my severance package and leave the premises immediately. He firmly believed he was simply discarding a useless weak link in his corporate chain to secure his powerful legacy forever. And in doing so, he had unknowingly handed me the absolute power to completely destroy them all without ever lifting a single finger against them again. I knew it was only a matter of time before my father reached out. He was a man who viewed apologies as a terminal weakness, so he would never call to beg for forgiveness or admit he had made a catastrophic mistake. He would try to strong-arm me instead. He would leverage his parental authority and frame his desperation as a simple routine corporate directive. I did not have to wait long to see his highly predictable strategy unfold. My personal cell phone buzzed sharply against the granite countertop. He was terrified that if we spoke, his trembling voice would betray the absolute panic consuming his chest. Instead, he chose the emotionally distant route of a text message. I picked up the phone and looked at the notification banner illuminating my locked screen. The message was from Charles Miller. I did not have him saved as Dad in my personal contacts anymore. That title required a level of care, affection, and protection he had never bothered to provide for me. I slowly unlocked the screen and opened the message thread. The text was an absolute masterpiece of corporate delusion and manipulative toxic parenting. He did not start with a polite greeting. He did not ask how I was doing after being brutally fired and humiliated in front of hundreds of people. He simply issued a cold, demanding command. "Send us the private contact number for Mr. Saito immediately." My father typed his words dripping with false, unearned authority. "Bianca has been experiencing some technical difficulties with the international servers, and her emails are bouncing back. You are required to attend a brief mandatory video conference with the executive board tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock sharp." I stared at the glowing screen, letting out a soft, genuine laugh that echoed clearly in the quiet, peaceful space of my kitchen. The sheer, blinding audacity of his message was almost impressive to witness. He was staring straight down the barrel of a $300 million default that would leave him completely homeless and bankrupt by Monday morning. Yet he still could not bring himself to ask for my help respectfully. He tried to falsely frame the catastrophic cultural insult Bianca had carelessly delivered as a mere technical difficulty with an email server. He thought he could snap his fingers and firmly order me to attend a mandatory morning meeting, as if I were still his obedient, terrified junior employee. For a brief, fleeting moment, I thought about the little girl I used to be. I thought about the anxious teenager who would study for hours just to get a brief dismissive nod from the powerful man sitting at the head of the dining table. I thought about the dedicated woman who had willingly sacrificed her personal life, romantic relationships, and physical health just to keep his company afloat in an unforgiving foreign market. That insecure, desperate version of Josephine would have frantically replied to his demanding message. She would have sent the private phone number immediately and logged into the video conference early the next morning, eager to prove her worth and save her family from total financial ruin. But that version of Josephine had died permanently in the lavish ballroom of the Plaza Hotel. She was entirely erased by the harsh sound of that manila severance envelope hitting the fine china dinner plate. The independent woman sitting in the quiet kitchen right now felt absolutely nothing for the desperate, arrogant man demanding her swift compliance. He was just a failing, aging executive thrashing wildly in the deep, dangerous water of his own massive mistakes. I tapped the empty text box at the bottom of my screen. I did not need to draft a long emotional paragraph detailing my years of accumulated pain. I did not need to explain the complex legal intricacies of the key personnel clause or openly mock him for his impending unavoidable bankruptcy. The most powerful, devastating weapon I possessed right now was absolute, unbothered detachment. I kept my response incredibly brief, slicing right through his desperate, commanding facade with cold, surgical precision. I do not work for you. I typed, my thumbs moving slowly and deliberately across the digital keyboard. Try the app. I hit send and watched the small green bubble appear on the bright screen. It was a single, devastating sentence that completely dismantled his remaining illusion of power over me. I was officially rejecting his parental authority and his corporate commands in one swift, effortless motion. I was directly reminding him that the cheap mobile application Bianca had so proudly flaunted was the exact substitute they had actively chosen over my years of loyalty. They wanted modern, aggressive American tactics, and I was giving them exactly what they asked for. I was leaving them entirely to their own destructive devices without a single ounce of guilt. I placed the phone face up on the cool counter and watched the screen closely. Almost instantly, 3 small gray dots appeared at the bottom of the message thread. My father was typing a reply. The dots danced nervously, indicating a flurry of furious, chaotic keystrokes. I could vividly imagine him standing in his lavish corner office, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson as he pounded his fingers against his smartphone screen. He was probably drafting a massive, furious wall of text filled with empty threats, harsh demands, and aggressive corporate posturing. He was likely screaming at the digital screen, furious that his disposable daughter had just slammed the heavy iron door directly in his face. The gray dots vanished for a split second, then immediately reappeared as he frantically deleted his angry words and started typing all over again. The mounting panic was bubbling up, completely overtaking his initial anger. He was finally realizing that I was not bluffing or throwing a childish tantrum. He was realizing that I held the absolute power to let Miller Holdings burn completely to the ground, and I was perfectly content to sit back and watch the raging flames. I watched the typing indicator bounce on my screen, feeling a deep, profound sense of closure. The long, grueling battle for my family respect was officially over, and I had won by simply refusing to play their toxic game anymore. As I waited to see what desperate, pathetic manipulation my father would attempt next, the screen of my mobile phone suddenly changed. The gray typing bubbles vanished, completely replaced by an incoming call notification. The device began to vibrate heavily against the granite countertop, emitting a sharp, urgent ringtone that shattered the peaceful silence of my apartment. I looked down at the caller identification, expecting to see my father name flashing angrily across the digital display. Instead, my breath caught very sharply in my throat as I stared closely at the bright numbers glowing steadily on the illuminated screen. The sudden, unexpected incoming call was clearly not coming from a local New York area code. It was not my father attempting to scream at me through the phone, and it was certainly not Preston calling to arrogantly demand my immediate cooperation. The numbers displayed on the glass screen clearly began with a specific, familiar international sequence. It was a Tokyo country code coming directly from Japan. I knew instantly that this simple international phone call was going to completely change the entire trajectory of my life forever. The balance of power had officially and permanently shifted in my favor. I took a slow, deep breath and picked up my vibrating phone from the cold granite countertop. Swiping my thumb across the bright screen, I accepted the connection. I did not offer a casual greeting. I spoke in the most formal, respectful register of the Japanese language, using the specific honorifics CEO Kenji Saito commanded. I politely stated my name and thanked him for reaching out directly. For a brief second, there was nothing but the faint static hum of the international connection. Then Mr. Saito began to speak. I had known this powerful billionaire for 8 long years, sharing quiet traditional tea ceremonies in his Kyoto estate. I had never once heard him raise his voice or lose his immaculate composure. He was a man who communicated through subtle gestures and measured pauses. But tonight his voice was practically unrecognizable. Mr. Saito spoke in rapid, furious Japanese, his words clipping together with a sharp, biting intensity. He was absolutely livid. He skipped the traditional pleasantries and launched directly into a blistering evisceration of my father and brother. He told me that in his 40 years of conducting global business, he had never encountered such a staggering display of profound disrespect and unearned arrogance. Mr. Saito did not need to repeat every mistake I had already witnessed. He summarized the damage with the precision of a man delivering a formal judgment. His advisors had reviewed the conference recording Preston's ultimatum and the subsequent correspondence. Taken together, they showed that Miller Holdings had not suffered a technical misunderstanding. Its leadership had deliberately rejected the standards of conduct on which the relationship had been built. What angered him most was not a single mistranslated sentence. It was the assumption behind it. My family believed respect was decorative, that patience was weakness, and that a powerful foreign investor could be rushed, threatened, and publicly cornered. The translation application had exposed their ignorance, but Preston's email had confirmed that the ignorance was supported by policy. Mr. Saito told me his legal team had completed its review before placing the call. The conclusion was final. Saito Industries would issue no corrective meeting except no revised wording and enter no emergency renegotiation with Charles or Preston. The original financing structure would be terminated through the mechanism already contained in the agreement. He paused, and his voice softened slightly when he spoke my name. He wanted me to understand that the decision was not a rejection of the work I had done. The trust created over 8 years remained intact. What had failed was the organization that had chosen to remove the person responsible for maintaining that trust. Then he confirmed that the formal notice would be filed immediately. Once it reached New York, Miller Holdings would be left to face every commitment it had made without his capital. The contract was over, but the professional relationship between Mr. Saito and me was not. A heavy silence fell over the phone line as he finished speaking. He was waiting for my reaction. He was likely expecting me to panic to beg for a second chance, or frantically offer to step in and fix the terrible damage my family had caused to save my father from financial ruin. Instead, I remained perfectly calm. I looked out the window of my apartment, watching the distant traffic moving down the Manhattan streets below. I took another slow, deep breath and shifted my posture, leaning comfortably against the kitchen island. "I am no longer with the company, Saito-san," I replied, my voice completely devoid of panic. My father and brother publicly terminated my employment last Friday evening. They chose to replace my cultural expertise with a mobile translation application because they firmly believed my careful methods were obsolete. I am entirely separate from the dishonorable actions of Miller Holdings. I heard a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. Mr. Saito was momentarily stunned by my calm admission. He quickly asked if I was all right, expressing genuine concern for my termination. I assured him I was more than all right. I was operating on my own terms. However, I continued making sure my Japanese pronunciation was flawless. My personal consulting firm, which we hypothetically discussed over dinner in Tokyo last year, is now officially incorporated and fully operational. I hold the sole executive authority, and I operate with the strict honor and respect you require. I will see you in New York. The silence that followed was thick with shifting possibilities. I had essentially told a furious global billionaire that I had anticipated the total destruction of my family empire and already positioned myself to catch the falling pieces. I was offering him a direct alternative path, bypassing the toxic incompetence of my father and brother. For a few agonizing seconds, I heard nothing but the faint crackle of the long-distance connection. My heart beat a heavy, rhythmic pulse against my ribs as I waited for his judgment. Then, to my absolute astonishment, a deep, rich sound echoed through the speaker. Mr. Saito was laughing. It was a hearty expression of profound respect and genuine amusement. He praised my incredible foresight, calling my strategic preparation a brilliant display of true corporate vision. He told me he had always suspected I was the only capable mind operating within the arrogant structure of Miller Holdings. He admitted he had only entertained the aggressive demands of my father because he deeply valued the unbreakable trust he had built specifically with me. Then the billionaire chief executive officer shifted the entire landscape of my professional world. He told me his anger toward my family had not diminished his desire to expand his corporate legacy. He still fully intended to invest the $1.5 billion into the lucrative American commercial real estate market. The capital was allocated and ready to be deployed, but he flatly refused to give a single penny to men who lacked honor and basic professional decency. He wanted to build something entirely new from the ground up. He wanted to bypass the established arrogant American firms and create a highly aggressive United States acquisitions company under the prestigious Saito banner. He needed someone with deep cultural knowledge, fierce intelligence, and absolute unshakable loyalty to run it. "I am establishing Saito United States Holdings tomorrow morning," he stated, his voice returning to its usual calm, powerful register. "And I will only move forward with this massive financial expansion if you agree to spearhead the entire operation as my primary managing director." For several seconds, I said nothing. The offer was larger than any title I had imagined for myself, but what affected me most was the clarity behind it. Mr. Saito was not rewarding me out of sympathy, and he was not hiring me to repair the damage caused by my family. He was asking me to build an organization whose structure reflected the principles I had defended for years. I asked direct questions about governance, reporting authority, and the limits of the position. His answers were equally direct. The new company would be independent from Miller Holdings. Its decisions would be evaluated on performance, discipline, and long-term trust, rather than family hierarchy. I would be responsible for assembling the American team and presenting the first acquisition strategy to Tokyo. Only after those terms were clear did I accept. When the call ended, I remained beside the kitchen island for a long moment, listening to the ordinary sounds of traffic below. Nothing in the room had changed yet. My future no longer depended on whether Charles approved of me or whether Preston allowed me a seat at his table. By morning, the legal documents would define the authority. Tonight, it was enough to know that my work had finally opened a door my family could not close. The morning sun cast brilliant shadows across the mahogany table of the private executive suite I rented at the Waldorf Astoria. I arrived 10 minutes early, dressed in a sharp charcoal suit that projected the exact authority I was about to assume. At 8 o'clock, the heavy double doors opened, and the Kenji Saito elite legal team filed into the room. There were 4 senior partners flown directly from Tokyo on a private jet the previous night. They did not treat me like the disposable assistant my father had insisted I was. They bowed with profound respect, recognizing me as the sole representative of their most powerful client. We sat down, and the lead attorney carefully opened a thick leather briefcase, placing a stack of pristine legal documents directly in front of me. This was the moment everything changed. I took my time reading through the meticulously drafted contracts, savoring the quiet, professional atmosphere. The terms were staggering in their scope, an unprecedented generosity. Mr. Saito was not simply hiring me to manage his capital. He was legally transferring total executive control of his entire American investment portfolio directly into my hands. The documents clearly outlined the immediate creation of Saito United States Holdings, an independent corporate entity fully backed by his initial $1.5 billion capital injection. My title was printed on the top of every single page: Managing Director and Chief Executive Officer. I was granted absolute unilateral authority to acquire, liquidate, or destroy any commercial real estate asset in the country without needing an additional signature from Tokyo. He had handed me a loaded financial weapon. I picked up the heavy gold fountain pen the lead attorney offered and felt the cool metal rest against my skin. For a fleeting second, I thought about the thousands of hours I had spent translating documents for Preston, watching him arrogantly sign his name to deals I had single-handedly negotiated. I thought about my father coldly dismissing my existence in front of hundreds of people just days prior. I pushed those memories away, replacing them with a profound sense of purpose. I pressed the golden nib to the thick paper and signed my full name with smooth, deliberate strokes. I signed the incorporation documents, the fiduciary trust agreements, and the final executive authorization forms. As I capped the pen and pushed the stack back, I was instantly transformed. I was no longer Josephine Miller, the discarded daughter. I was a billionaire proxy with the power to level their empire. While I sat in the quiet luxury of the Waldorf suite discussing aggressive market acquisition strategies with my new legal team, my personal cell phone began to vibrate violently inside my purse. The absolute destruction of Miller Holdings was currently unfolding exactly as I had predicted. The Japanese delegation had officially filed the contract termination notices with the International Mediating Board, and the automated legal alerts had just hit the corporate servers in New York. The suffocating silence that had tortured my father and brother all week was shattered by the deafening sound of the financial guillotine dropping. My phone screen lit up with an endless, chaotic stream of incoming notifications. Missed calls, voicemails, and frantic text messages poured in at terrifying speed. They were finally realizing that their aggressive ultimatums had triggered their own spectacular execution. I excused myself from the table and walked to the large bay windows, looking out over the bustling Manhattan streets below as I checked my messages. My father and brother were rapidly cycling through the classic stages of corporate grief, swinging violently between explosive anger and pathetic desperation. I pressed the small icon to listen to the first voicemail left by Preston. His voice was a harsh, ragged scream that distorted the audio completely. He demanded to know what I had said to the Saito delegation to poison the deal against him. He threatened to sue me for corporate sabotage, claiming he would drag my name through the mud and ensure I never worked in the industry again. He was thrashing blindly in the water, furious that the inferior sister he had so casually discarded possessed the power to permanently cut off his lifeline. The next voicemail was from my father, and the panic vibrating in his voice was almost sweet to listen to. He had completely dropped his aggressive, commanding tone. Charles Miller, the ruthless chief executive officer who had publicly humiliated me without a second thought, was now literally begging his daughter to answer the phone. He stammered through an awkward apology, claiming that there had been a terrible misunderstanding regarding my termination. He promised to double my salary, promote me to a senior vice president role, and publicly reinstate me if I would just call Tokyo and smooth things over. He pleaded with me to think about the family legacy, to remember the business he had built from nothing. He was staring directly at Monday morning bridge loan default, and the terror was breaking him apart. I stood by the window listening to their pathetic, desperate voices with absolute emotional detachment. They did not miss me as a daughter or a sister. They only missed the convenient shield I had always provided to protect them from their own staggering incompetence. They expected me to sacrifice my own dignity to rescue their fragile egos. I did not waste my breath returning their calls. I did not send a text message explaining my new position. I simply opened the contact settings on my phone, selected my father and brother, and permanently blocked their numbers. I cut their final desperate lifeline with a single effortless swipe of my thumb, leaving them to drown in the silent, toxic debt they had created. I returned to the mahogany table and continued my strategic planning with the Japanese attorneys, unbothered by the chaos consuming the Miller corporate headquarters. However, My father was a man who absolutely refused to accept defeat, even when the battle was already legally over. When digital channels of communication failed to produce the results he demanded, he decided to resort to the only tactic he truly understood. He chose to escalate the situation into a massive public spectacle. Charles firmly believed that money and public pressure could force anyone into submission, regardless of cultural traditions or binding legal clauses. He convinced himself that Kenji Saito was simply using the termination notice as an aggressive negotiation tactic and that a grand gesture would force the billionaire back to the table. Through discreet communications with David in the accounting department, I learned the exact details of my father's incredibly foolish final maneuver. Charles and Preston had authorized the emergency expenditure of hundreds of thousands of dollars they did not possess to rent out the most exclusive penthouse venue in Manhattan for Thursday evening. They were pouring the last remaining drops of their corporate cash reserves into an elaborate, desperate trap. They hired premium catering services, arranged for expensive floral displays, and drafted a new set of highly favorable acquisition documents. But the most dangerous aspect of their plan was the guest list. My father had invited dozens of prominent industry journalists, real estate photographers, and financial news reporters to attend what he was actively billing as a historic international merger celebration. Charles and Preston were attempting to aggressively corner a global billionaire in front of the entire American financial press. They planned to ambush the Saito delegation with flashing cameras and massive public expectations, forcing them to sign the new agreements to avoid a public relations disaster. They were relying on the arrogant assumption that Kenji Saito would simply smile for the cameras and accept the deal rather than cause a scene in front of the media. They had no idea that the distinguished Japanese delegation was already back in Tokyo, and that the only person representing Saito Industries in New York was the daughter they had just brutally fired. They were setting the stage for their own highly publicized public execution, and I was more than happy to attend the party. The 48-hour countdown to the highly publicized signing ceremony began with a surreal sense of calm. I sat in my quiet apartment watching the financial news networks cover the impending event with breathless anticipation. Through the glowing screen of my television, I watched my brother Preston standing in the middle of the rented Manhattan penthouse, giving exclusive interviews to top business journalists. He was wearing his signature custom-tailored suit, but the high-definition cameras captured the dark, exhausted circles under his eyes and the tight, nervous tension in his jaw. Despite his physical exhaustion, Preston was putting on the performance of a lifetime. He flashed his arrogant, practiced smile at the reporters, falsely claiming that Miller Holdings was about to finalize the most lucrative international real estate acquisition of the decade. He spoke smoothly about bridging cultural gaps and dominating the global market, completely omitting the terrifying reality that the $300 million bridge loan was due on Monday morning. Preston strutted around the lavish penthouse, pointing out the breathtaking views of the city skyline and the massive mahogany table where the historic documents would allegedly be signed. My father had spared absolutely no expense in setting this desperate trap. David sent me photographs of the extravagant catering orders, the premium champagne towers, and the towering floral arrangements that were currently draining the very last reserves of the company accounts. They had meticulously constructed a flawless illusion of corporate invincibility. They genuinely believed that by creating an environment of intense public expectation and media scrutiny, they could effectively back a global billionaire into a corner. They thought Kenji Saito would be too concerned about public optics to walk away from a highly publicized press event. While Preston was busy feeding carefully crafted lies to the financial media, my father was desperately trying to force the Japanese delegation to actually show up. Charles sent a highly formal digital invitation directly to the executive offices of Saito Industries, formally requesting their honorable presence at the penthouse ceremony on Friday morning. I was sitting in my temporary office at the Waldorf Astoria when the invitation was forwarded to my secure email address by the Tokyo legal team. I reviewed the desperate pleading language my father had carefully hidden beneath corporate jargon, and then I initiated a secure call with Mr. Saito. We discussed the invitation at length. I explained the exact psychological trap my father and brother were attempting to spring. I detailed the intense media presence and the crushing financial pressure of the impending bridge loan default. Mr. Saito listened quietly to my assessment, his silence speaking volumes about his profound disdain for their dishonorable tactics. When I finished my analysis, he simply stated that a public insult of this magnitude required a public resolution. He instructed his legal team to send a brief formal response to Miller Holdings indicating that he and his senior advisors would indeed attend the ceremony in New York. The moment the acceptance email hit the corporate servers at Miller Holdings, the entire executive floor erupted into a frenzy of blind, arrogant celebration. David sent me a quick voice memo from the stairwell describing the scene. He told me that Charles and Preston were literally popping bottles of vintage champagne in the corner office. They were clapping each other on the back, loudly cheering their own supposed brilliance. They were entirely convinced that their aggressive, hostile American business tactics had finally broken the stubborn resolve of the traditional Japanese billionaires. They believed their threatening ultimatums had forced Mr. Saito to cave under the pressure. Their blinding hubris prevented them from realizing that a man who controls an international empire does not surrender to desperate bankrupt bullies. They thought they had finally won the war, when in reality they had just cheerfully scheduled their own firing squad. I spent the evening before the ceremony in a state of absolute focused tranquility. I did not review any more financial documents or check the corporate news wires. I simply prepared myself for the final act of this incredible drama. When the sun rose over Manhattan on Friday morning, the golden light filtered through my bedroom window, signaling the end of an era. I got out of bed and walked to my closet to select my armor for the day. For 8 years, I had deliberately dressed in muted, conservative tones, trying to blend into the background so I would not outshine the fragile ego of my older brother. Today, I was stepping permanently into the spotlight. I chose a flawless, tailored power suit in a deep, striking shade of charcoal gray. The fabric was immaculate, the cut sharp and uncompromising. I paired it with a crisp white silk blouse and simple, elegant heels. I pulled my hair back into a sleek, professional style and applied my makeup with meticulous care. When I looked in the full-length mirror, I did not see the terrified, eager-to-please daughter who had spent her youth begging for scraps of parental affection. I saw the confident, untouchable managing director of Saito United States Holdings. I saw a woman who possessed the absolute power to dismantle the toxic family that had tried to destroy her. I picked up my leather briefcase holding the finalized incorporation documents and the binding executive authority agreements that proved my new corporate identity. I walked out of my apartment building and stepped onto the busy morning sidewalk. Waiting for me at the curb was a pristine black town car with heavily tinted windows. The driver stepped out immediately and opened the rear door, bowing his head respectfully. The vehicle had been sent directly by Mr. Saito to ensure I arrived at the venue with the exact level of prestige my new position demanded. I slid into the town car and placed the leather briefcase beside me. The driver merged into the morning traffic without conversation, giving me the silence I needed. Manhattan moved past the tinted windows in familiar fragments, delivery trucks blocking narrow lanes, office workers crossing against the light glass towers, catching the first clean reflections of the sun. For years I had traveled through these streets while answering calls from Preston, correcting documents for my father, or preparing apologies for mistakes neither of them would admit. That morning, my phone remained face down. The briefcase beside me contained proof of a different professional identity, one created without their permission and beyond their control. As we moved south, I reviewed the sequence ahead only once. Mr. Saito would enter through the private elevator with his legal team. The press would be positioned around the signing table. Charles and Preston would expect a negotiation. Our purpose was not to argue with them. It was to state the legal reality clearly enough that no one in the room could distort it afterward. The driver turned onto the final avenue, and the atmosphere outside changed. Satellite vans occupied the curb. Camera crews adjusted cables beside the entrance while producers spoke urgently into headsets. Reporters clustered behind temporary barriers rehearsing introductions about the historic partnership Miller Holdings believed it was about to announce. The scale of the spectacle might once have unsettled me. Instead, it confirmed how completely my father had committed himself to the performance. He had invited witnesses because he believed witnesses would create pressure. He had never considered that they might also preserve the truth. The car stopped beneath the building's awning. Across the street, another black vehicle waited with members of Mr. Saito's security detail already inside. I closed my hand around the briefcase handle, took one measured breath, and stepped out. I took one final calming breath and stepped out onto the sidewalk, avoiding the flashing cameras by slipping through the discreet private service entrance Mr. Saito had secured for our team. Upstairs in the lavishly decorated penthouse, the atmosphere was thick with unearned victory and blinding arrogance. I stood quietly in the shadowed alcove of the private staging room, observing the main event space through a cracked door. The venue was absolutely packed with prominent financial journalists, wealthy private investors, and eager photographers, adjusting their heavy camera lenses. Waiters in crisp white uniforms moved seamlessly through the dense crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with crystal flutes of premium vintage champagne. A massive towering floral arrangement of white orchids dominated the center of the room perfectly, matching the pristine aesthetic my father always demanded. At the far end of the sprawling space stood the massive polished mahogany table where the historic merger documents were prominently displayed. Charles and Preston Miller stood at the head of that table, holding court like conquering kings who had just won a grueling war. Preston was wearing his most expensive custom-tailored suit, his hair perfectly styled, and his posture radiating absolute smug confidence. He was laughing loudly at a joke made by a reporter, his teeth flashing bright white under the harsh media lights. In his right hand, he casually twirled a heavy gold custom fountain pen, the exact instrument he fully intended to use to sign away Mr. Saito and his billion-dollar fortune. My father stood right beside him, exuding the quiet, ruthless authority he had used to crush his competitors for decades. He looked at his gold Rolex watch and smiled knowingly at the surrounding crowd, completely convinced that his aggressive American business tactics had successfully forced the Japanese billionaire into total submission. They genuinely believed that by surrounding Mr. Saito with eager reporters and flashing cameras, they could trap the honorable man into signing a deal he despised. They were blindly drinking their own expensive champagne, completely unaware that the bridge loans were still breathing down their necks, and their corporate executioners were already in the building. The low, steady murmur of the crowded room was suddenly shattered by the sharp, melodic chime of the private VIP elevator arriving at the penthouse floor. A sudden, breathless hush instantly fell over the entire venue as every single head turned toward the polished brass doors. The journalists immediately raised their cameras, their fingers hovering eagerly over the shutter buttons. Preston quickly straightened his expensive silk tie and shot a triumphant, knowing glance at my father, who offered a firm, approving nod in return. The heavy brass doors slid open with a soft mechanical hiss, revealing the absolute pinnacle of international corporate power. Mr. Kenji Saito stepped out of the elevator, moving with the slow, deliberate grace of a man who commanded massive global empires. He was dressed immaculately in a dark traditional suit, his expression entirely unreadable, and his posture projecting an intimidating level of absolute authority. Behind him filed an incredibly massive entourage of elite Tokyo legal advisors, senior executive partners, and private security personnel. They moved in perfect unison, a silent, unstoppable wave of dark suits and briefcases that instantly commanded the respect of every single person in the room. The sudden flurry of flashing camera bulbs illuminated the penthouse like a chaotic lightning storm, capturing the historic arrival for the morning financial papers. The sheer magnitude of the Saito delegation was staggering, and the heavy, oppressive weight of their collective presence immediately sucked the oxygen out of the lavish room. My father and brother had expected a defeated billionaire forced to surrender to their demands, but instead they were facing a highly disciplined corporate army that had arrived to oversee their total destruction. Preston immediately stepped forward to spring the elaborate trap, his face splitting into a wide, overly aggressive smile that practically screamed unearned corporate arrogance. He walked directly toward the center of the room, extending his right hand in a forceful, dominant gesture designed to completely command the flashing cameras and force the traditional Japanese billionaire into a submissive public handshake. "Welcome to New York, Mr. Saito," my brother announced, his loud, booming voice echoing clearly across the sudden dead silence of the penthouse. "We are absolutely thrilled that you finally decided to see reason and join us today to finalize this historic, lucrative partnership." The bright, flashing camera lights reflected sharply off the heavy gold fountain pen, still clutched tightly in his trembling left hand. The eager financial reporters leaned in very closely, holding their collective breath as they waited for the distinguished executive to accept the arrogant gesture and formally surrender to the Miller family empire. Mr. Saito did not raise his hand to meet my brother. He did not slow his steady, deliberate pacing across the thick carpet. He did not even bother to glance at the arrogant young man standing directly in his path. Instead, the powerful billionaire simply stopped a few feet away from the mahogany table, his dark, calculating eyes fixed coldly on my father. The deafening silence stretched into agonizing, torturous seconds as Preston stood there completely frozen, with his hand extended, his confident smile slowly fracturing into a tragic mask of pure, bewildered panic. The surrounding journalists exchanged confused, nervous glances, clearly sensing the sudden, terrifying shift in the room atmosphere. Then, with a subtle, almost imperceptible nod from Mr. Saito, the massive, intimidating crowd of Japanese executives slowly parted down the middle like a dark, silent sea dividing. They stepped aside in perfect, flawless unison to reveal the single person holding absolute executive authority over the entire American investment portfolio. I stepped forward directly into the blinding glare of the camera lights, wearing my flawless, tailored charcoal power suit and a calm, unbreakable, confident smile. I walked smoothly and proudly through the parted crowd of billionaires and powerful lawyers, stopping perfectly shoulder to shoulder with Mr. Saito. The heavy gold fountain pen finally slipped from my brother, trembling, sweating fingers hitting the polished hardwood floor with a sharp, devastating clatter. They had confidently built a spectacular public trap, and I was the only one holding the key. For one suspended second, no one reacted. The photographers nearest the signing table lowered their cameras just enough to look directly at me, trying to understand why the woman introduced to them as a dismissed employee had emerged from the center of Mr. Saito's delegation. Charles recognized the arrangement before Preston did. His eyes moved from my suit to the attorneys behind me, then to the sealed portfolio carried by the lead counsel. The calculation spreading across his face was more revealing than any confession. He understood that I had not entered the room alone, and that my presence had been planned by the very people he was trying to pressure. Preston remained fixed in place, his empty hand still extended toward Mr. Saito. The confidence in his posture collapsed unevenly. His shoulders tightened, his jaw opened, and the color drained from his face beneath the glare of the camera lights. The silence gave the press time to capture everything: the abandoned pen on the floor, my father's sudden fear, and my brother's inability to complete the performance he had designed. Then Preston's confusion hardened into rage. Preston finally managed to close his gaping mouth, but the arrogant hubris that had defined his entire life quickly mutated into explosive, defensive rage. A deep, ugly shade of crimson crept up his neck and rapidly consumed his face. He dropped his extended hand and took a threatening, aggressive step forward, his perfectly styled hair falling out of place. He completely ignored the traditional Japanese customs I had spent years trying to teach him. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my chest and raised his voice, echoing loudly across the crowded venue. "What the hell is she doing here?" Preston screamed, his voice cracking under the intense pressure of the flashing media lights. He turned frantically toward the venue doors, completely losing control of his carefully crafted corporate image. "Security, get in here right now. She is a disgruntled former employee." She has absolutely no authorization to be in this building. Security, remove her immediately. Two large men in dark uniforms stepped forward from the back of the room, but they did not get far. The massive, intimidating crowd of elite Tokyo legal advisors and private security personnel that had accompanied Mr. Saito shifted seamlessly. They formed an impenetrable human wall between the venue's security and where I stood shoulder to shoulder with the billionaire. They did not say a single word or raise a hand in anger. Their sheer disciplined presence was enough to stop the American guards dead in their tracks. The reporters leaned in closer, their microphones extended, catching every single desperate sound my brother made. Preston was thrashing wildly in a trap he had built himself, completely unaware that the jaws had already snapped shut. My father stepped forward quickly, grabbing Preston by the arm and pulling him back, trying desperately to salvage the catastrophic public relations disaster unfolding before his eyes. He offered an awkward, strained laugh, attempting to smooth over the chaos for the watching journalists. "Please excuse my son, Mr. Saito," Charles said, his voice tight with barely concealed panic. "There has clearly been a terrible breach of protocol today. We will have this confused young woman escorted out immediately so we can finally sign the merger documents and celebrate our new partnership." Mr. Kenji Saito did not look at my father. He did not look at my brother. He did not look at the frantic security guards or the eager reporters pushing against the velvet ropes. The powerful global executive remained perfectly still, his dark eyes fixed straight ahead, radiating a terrifying level of absolute calm. Then he made a single deliberate movement. He slowly raised his right hand. It was a simple, elegant gesture, but it carried the weight of a multi-billion-dollar international empire. The effect was immediate and absolute. The frantic clicking of the cameras slowed and then stopped entirely. The confused murmurs of the crowded room vanished. Even Preston silenced his desperate shouting, choking on his own toxic rage. The lavish Manhattan penthouse fell into a suffocating, deathly quiet. You could clearly hear the faint hum of city traffic moving through the streets below the thick glass windows. Everyone in the room was holding their collective breath, waiting for the traditional Japanese billionaire to rely on a translator to express his outrage. When Mr. Saito finally spoke, the sound sent a visible physical shockwave through the entire room. He did not speak in the rapid, formal Japanese he had used during our private telephone call. He did not wait for one of his elite advisors to step forward and translate his words into English. Instead, the powerful billionaire spoke in flawless, unaccented American English. His voice was deep, resonant, and commanded absolute, unquestionable authority. "Josephine's son is not here for you," Mr. Saito stated, his words cutting through the heavy silence like a sharpened steel blade. The sheer shock on the faces of my father and brother was a masterpiece of tragic irony. Their jaws went slack, their eyes widening in profound disbelief. For 8 long years, they had arrogantly assumed that Mr. Saito could only understand and speak his native language. They had treated him like an ignorant foreigner, relying entirely on my careful translations and eventually a cheap mobile application to communicate their hostile demands. They had spoken openly and disrespectfully in front of him multiple times, firmly believing they were protected by an impenetrable language barrier. Now, in front of the entire American financial press, they were brutally realizing that the billionaire had understood every single arrogant word they had ever spoken. He continued, his flawless English echoing clearly across the frozen room. "She is not a disgruntled employee, and she is certainly not a confused young woman. You are addressing the sole executive authority of my entire American investment portfolio. She is not here for you. She is here as my managing director." The journalists in the room erupted into a sudden frenzy of shocked whispers and rapidly scribbled notes. This was no longer a story about a lucrative corporate merger. This was the highly publicized execution of the Miller family legacy. I stood tall beside my new business partner, letting the monumental weight of his words settle heavily over my father and brother. Charles staggered backwards slightly, as if he had been physically struck in the chest. His terrified eyes darted toward the mahogany table, where the fraudulent acquisition documents waited to be signed. He was finally connecting the pieces, realizing that the $300 million bridge loan due on Monday morning was going to completely destroy him. Preston looked like a broken man who had just watched his own ghost walk into the room. He stared at me, his chest heaving with panicked breaths, trying to comprehend how the sister he had publicly fired and discarded had somehow returned holding the keys to the kingdom he desperately needed. Mr. Saito was not finished. He slowly reached inside his immaculate suit jacket. The entire room watched in absolute fascination as he withdrew a few folded sheets of white paper. He unfolded them with deliberate precision. I recognized the document instantly. It was the disastrous hostile contract Bianca generated using her cheap translation app. The billionaire stepped forward, closing the distance between himself and the massive mahogany table. Instead of looking at the new, highly favorable contracts my father prepared, he tossed the translation document onto the polished wood. The camera zoomed in tight as he pointed directly at Charles Miller. Mr. Saito held his finger steady for a long, agonizing moment, letting the flashing cameras capture the exact image of my father shrinking under his intense gaze. The silence in the penthouse was absolute. No one dared to move or breathe as the billionaire lowered his hand and tapped the wrinkled translation document he had just thrown onto the table. "That piece of paper, Charles, is the exact measure of your family legacy," Mr. Saito said, his deep voice carrying effortlessly across the massive room. "You invited the global financial press here today to celebrate a historic partnership. So let us give them a completely transparent look at the exceptional business acumen of Miller Holdings." He turned his dark, piercing eyes toward Preston, who was now sweating profusely, his arrogant posture completely deflated. "Your son Preston is not a visionary executive. He is an incompetent, arrogant child who relies on free mobile applications to negotiate billion-dollar international acquisitions." Mr. Saito allowed the room to absorb the announcement before continuing. He explained that my appointment was not symbolic and had not been made in response to the morning's conflict. His legal and financial teams had reviewed 8 years of correspondence negotiation records, risk assessments, and completed transactions. The record showed a consistent pattern. When the relationship advanced, my work was present. When Miller leadership interfered, the relationship deteriorated. He placed one hand on the portfolio carried by his lead counsel. The documents inside transferred operational authority because the evidence supported that decision. He was not asking the press to accept his personal opinion of me. He was inviting them to examine the same documented performance that Charles and Preston had ignored. The reporters in the room began murmuring among themselves, the narrative of the great American corporate triumph completely disintegrating before their eager eyes. My father stepped forward, raising his hands in a desperate, placating gesture. "Mr. Saito, please." Charles stammered, his voice stripped of all its usual commanding power. "We can explain everything. There were simply some unfortunate miscommunications regarding the restructuring of our executive team. We are more than willing to offer you the highly favorable terms outlined in these new contracts today. We can move past this and finalize the financing right now." Mr. Saito let out a short, harsh laugh that echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. "Financing," he repeated the word, dripping with pure, unadulterated contempt. "You do not want a partnership, Charles. You are desperate for a rescue. You thought I was an ignorant foreigner who would simply hand over billions of dollars without conducting my own rigorous, independent due diligence. You thought you could hide the fact that Miller Holdings is currently bleeding to death." Preston moved backward until the edge of the mahogany table stopped him. The reporters immediately shifted their microphones toward Mr. Saito, sensing that the announcement of my appointment was only the beginning. The billionaire asked his lead attorney to open the sealed portfolio. 3 documents were placed on the table: the original financing agreement, the personnel schedule attached to it, and the formal termination notice filed by Miller Holdings after the gala. The attorney arranged them side by side so the cameras could record the dates. Mr. Saito explained that his team had also completed an independent review of Miller Holdings' recent acquisitions. The review showed that Charles and Preston had committed $300 million in short-term borrowed capital before securing the permanent financing they had publicly claimed was guaranteed. The first default trigger would activate at 9 o'clock on Monday morning. That fact was not speculation or a negotiating threat. It appeared in the loan records obtained during due diligence. Charles attempted to interrupt, insisting that the debt was a temporary bridge supported by valuable property. Mr. Saito answered without raising his voice. Property value did not change the sequence of events. Miller Holdings had purchased assets with borrowed funds, removed the designated liaison from the transaction, and then demanded that Saito Industries supply capital under an agreement the company itself had invalidated. The lead attorney opened the original contract to Appendix 4, Section B. Mr. Saito did not repeat every sentence. He read only the operative condition the financing remained valid, while Josephine Miller served as the designated fiduciary mediator and primary project representative. Her removal allowed Saito Industries to terminate before funding without penalty. A second attorney held up the termination notice bearing the official Miller Holdings authorization and timestamp. It showed that my employment had ended before the planned signing. No outside party had created the breach. No translation error had altered the employment record. Charles and Preston had executed the action themselves. The room became so quiet that the faint hum of the camera equipment was audible. Mr. Saito turned toward my father. He stated that the termination option had already been exercised, that notice had been filed with the International Mediation Board, and that no funds would be transferred to Miller Holdings. The documents on the table were not invitations to renegotiate. They were the public record of a completed decision. Charles stared at the 3 pages as though their order might change if he looked long enough. Preston tried to speak, but the lead attorney calmly reminded him that every statement made in the room was being recorded. Mr. Saito then faced the cameras. Saito Industries remained committed to American investment, he said, but the capital would be deployed through Saito United States Holdings under my executive direction. The money had not disappeared. It had moved beyond the reach of the men who had mistaken pressure for authority. Only then did the reporters begin shouting questions. The penthouse erupted into absolute chaos. Reporters were shouting questions over each other, demanding statements about the impending bridge loan default and the total collapse of Miller Holdings. Camera shutters clicked in a blinding, relentless wave, capturing the brutal end of a corporate dynasty. Preston was literally shaking violently, his hands gripping the edge of the table to keep himself from collapsing onto the floor. The golden boy, the chosen heir to the family throne, had finally broken under the crushing weight of his own staggering incompetence. My father stood completely frozen in the center of the flashing lights. The arrogant, ruthless chief executive officer was gone entirely. In his place was a terrified, desperate old man, staring directly into the dark abyss of total financial ruin. He looked frantically around the chaotic room, at the eager journalists recording his downfall, at the impenetrable wall of Japanese executives, and finally at me. I stood perfectly still, shoulder to shoulder with the billionaire, projecting absolute glacial calm. Charles abandoned his prepared smile and moved toward me, stopping when Mr. Saito's security detail closed the space between us. His voice dropped low enough that the nearest microphones had to strain to catch it. He did not mention love or family, not yet. He spoke like an executive trying to preserve a transaction. He offered immediate reinstatement, a public correction of my termination, and written authority over every future negotiation with Tokyo. He promised that Preston would be removed from the deal and that Bianca would have no further role. If I returned before Monday, he said the board would approve any title and compensation package I requested. The proposal revealed exactly what he still failed to understand. He believed the problem was my job description. He thought enough money, authority, and ceremonial respect could reverse a decision that had already exposed the character of his leadership. I told him that the agreement was no longer mine to restore, and that my new responsibility was to protect Saito Capital, not rescue Miller Holdings from commitments it had made without secured funding. Charles looked toward the cameras and finally understood that there would be no private arrangement after the event. I stepped past him and joined Mr. Saito at the elevator. I turned my back on the terrified man who had controlled my entire existence and walked away. Mr. Saito matched my pace perfectly as we moved toward the private elevator. The heavy brass doors were already waiting open, held by his immaculate security detail. We stepped inside the luxurious car together, leaving the explosive chaos of the penthouse behind us. As the doors began to slide shut, the deafening roar of the financial press finally broke loose. Journalists surged forward like a tidal wave, crashing against the mahogany table, shouting frantic questions about the bridge loans and demanding immediate statements from the disgraced executives. Flashing camera lights reflected off the closing elevator doors, capturing the exact moment my father and brother were swallowed alive by the media frenzy they had so arrogantly orchestrated. The quiet hum of the descending elevator was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. When we reached the ground floor, the waiting town car whisked us away from the scene. I spent the weekend in a state of quiet reflection, while the American financial sector went into a meltdown. The news networks ran continuous coverage of the collapse at Miller Holdings. Pundits dissected the details of the $300 million bridge loan, calling it a catastrophic display of corporate hubris. Through discreet messages from David in accounting, I learned that Charles and Preston spent Saturday and Sunday trapped in a frantic nightmare. They made hundreds of desperate phone calls to private investors and offshore lenders, begging for a financial lifeline. They offered exorbitant interest rates and total equity control, but their humiliation had rendered them toxic. No one was willing to touch a dying company that had just been eviscerated by Kenji Saito. They were completely isolated, drowning in the dark waters of their own making. When the sun rose on Monday morning, the brutal reality arrived. The clock struck 9 and the massive bridge loans officially went into default. The reaction from the major banks was swift, merciless, and uncompromising. Within minutes of the missed payment deadline, automated financial mechanisms snapped into place across the city. The corporate accounts for Miller Holdings were instantly frozen, locking away whatever meager cash reserves they had managed to scrape together. I stood by the window of my new corner office at Saito Industries, watching the news helicopters circling the skies over my former workplace. Down on the street level, armed security teams contracted by the lending banks marched into the Miller corporate headquarters. They systematically locked down every floor, forced the remaining executives to pack their personal belongings into cardboard boxes, and escorted them out of the glass building. The empire my father had built through decades of intimidation was dismantled in less than 2 hours. But the corporate bankruptcy was only the beginning of Charles Miller's total destruction. Because he and Preston had been blindly confident in their ability to manipulate the Japanese delegation, they used their personal assets to secure the emergency bridge loans. The banks did not just seize the commercial properties and the corporate bank accounts. They immediately initiated foreclosure proceedings on everything my father owned. The massive historic family estate in Connecticut, the crown jewel of my father's arrogant legacy, was seized before noon. The sprawling manicured lawns, the private tennis courts, and the grand dining room, where he had spent years making me feel worthless, now belonged to a faceless banking conglomerate. Charles was forcibly removed from the only environment where he felt powerful, stripped of the wealth that had always shielded him. While my father watched his beloved estate slip away, Preston desperately tried to maintain the illusion of his elite lifestyle. On Monday evening, he retreated to the Manhattan restaurant he frequented with his fiancée, Bianca. He wore his expensive suit, but his posture was defeated, and his eyes wild with panic. He ordered premium cocktails and expensive appetizers, trying to convince Bianca that the morning events were just a temporary setback. He lied smoothly, telling her he had hidden offshore accounts and secret investors waiting in the wings to help them launch a brand new venture. Bianca sat across from him, sipping her drink and listening to his frantic promises with a cool, calculating expression. When the waiter arrived with the evening bill, Preston casually tossed his heavy platinum credit card onto the silver tray, exactly as he had done 1,000 times before. He continued talking about their upcoming lavish wedding in the Hamptons, trying to project the image of a man who was still in total control. The waiter walked away, but returned less than 3 minutes later. The young man looked incredibly uncomfortable as he leaned down and quietly informed my brother that the platinum card had been declined. Preston's face flushed dark red with embarrassment. He quickly pulled out a second premium card, blaming a bank error and offering a loud, arrogant laugh. The waiter swiped the second card, right there at the table, using a handheld terminal. The small digital screen flashed a bright red warning indicating the account was completely frozen. Bianca watched the red light illuminate the table, and the mask of her affection vanished instantly. She did not offer words of comfort or promise to stand by him during a difficult time. She simply reached into her expensive designer handbag, pulled out a crisp $50 bill, and dropped it onto the table to cover her drinks. She looked at Preston not with anger or sadness, but with absolute disgust. She slowly reached up to her left hand and slid the massive diamond engagement ring off her finger. She placed the ring precisely in the exact center of the unpaid dinner bill. Without saying a single word, Bianca stood up, turned her back on my brother, and walked out of the crowded restaurant. Preston sat there in silence, staring at the discarded ring. Finally realizing that the money was gone, the power was gone, and he was entirely alone. The 6 months that followed were not dramatic in the way the penthouse confrontation had been. They were procedural, quiet, and relentless. Court notices replaced television alerts. Auction schedules replaced executive calendars. The Miller name disappeared from industry invitations long before it disappeared from the remaining legal documents. Charles and Preston spent those months contesting valuations, requesting extensions, and searching for investors willing to separate the remaining assets from the scandal attached to them. No one did. Each hearing narrowed their choices until the final estate and corporate properties were placed into a private commercial auction. By winter, they were no longer waiting for a miraculous recovery. They were waiting to learn who had purchased the last physical pieces of the life they had built. That answer would be delivered on a freezing Tuesday morning inside a cramped bankruptcy law office in Lower Manhattan. There were no chandeliers, cameras, or polished mahogany tables. The room smelled of stale coffee and floor wax. It was the kind of place where illusions ended through signatures rather than speeches. Charles Miller sat slumped in a scuffed vinyl chair, staring blankly at the water stains on the drop ceiling. The ruthless, intimidating patriarch who used to command boardrooms with a single glare had completely vanished. He looked incredibly frail, his skin ashen, and his expensive tailored suits replaced by off-the-rack clothing that hung loosely on his shrinking frame. Preston paced the worn carpet like a caged animal. He had lost his fiancée, his penthouse, his luxury cars, and his unearned swagger. The arrogant grin was gone, entirely replaced by a permanent, bitter scowl that made him look desperate and old. He repeatedly checked his phone frantically, hoping for a last-minute miracle from some offshore investor who would never call. They were waiting to sign the final dissolution papers, waiting to find out which corporate vulture had purchased the very last remnants of their lifework at a private commercial auction. The crown jewel of those remaining assets was the historic Connecticut family estate, the physical manifestation of my father's precious legacy. The door creaked open, and their appointed bankruptcy attorney walked in carrying a thick manila folder. He did not offer them a warm greeting or a sympathetic smile. He simply tossed the heavy stack of documents onto the scratched veneer table. The attorney adjusted his glasses and bluntly informed them that a single anonymous buyer operating through a newly formed holding company had swept the auction entirely. The buyer had purchased the commercial headquarters, the remaining heavily leveraged strip malls, and the beloved family estate for absolute pennies on the dollar. The lending banks had already approved the transfer of deeds. Charles closed his eyes and let out a long, ragged sigh, finally accepting that his kingdom was gone forever. Preston immediately slammed his hands on the table, demanding to know the identity of the anonymous buyer who had stolen their home for a fraction of its true value. Before the tired attorney could even open his mouth to respond, the heavy wooden door to the conference room swung open again. The dull, oppressive atmosphere of the cramped office was instantly shattered. I walked into the room wearing a flawless, custom-tailored navy power suit, my heels clicking sharply against the cheap linoleum floor. I was not alone. Flanking me on either side was an elite team of corporate acquisition lawyers from Saito Industries, carrying themselves with the same impenetrable authority they had displayed in the penthouse 6 months prior. The sheer commanding presence of my legal team made the small room feel suffocatingly tight. I did not say a word as I walked directly toward the scratched table, maintaining perfect eye contact with the men who had tried to destroy me and taking the empty seat opposite my father and brother. The look of pure, unadulterated shock that washed over their faces was something I would carry with me for the rest of my life. Charles gripped the arms of his vinyl chair so tightly, his knuckles turned completely white. His jaw went slack, and his eyes widened as he tried to comprehend why the daughter he had so casually discarded was sitting across from him in a bankruptcy office. Preston actually stumbled backward, his shoulder hitting the cheap drywall with a dull thud. He stared at my immaculate suit and the confident, relaxed posture I maintained. He looked at the elite attorneys standing silently behind me like loyal soldiers. The gears in his mind ground together as he slowly connected my sudden appearance to the anonymous corporate buyer the attorney had just mentioned minutes ago. I reached into my leather briefcase and withdrew the finalized acquisition contracts, the very documents that officially transferred ownership of the Miller family estate and the corporate headquarters into my exclusive control. I placed my hands flat against the documents and smoothly slid them across the table until they rested directly in front of my father. I watched his trembling eyes read the name of the new holding company printed in bold black ink, followed immediately by my own signature as the sole executive director. I had used the massive, generous liaison commission Mr. Saito had paid me, combined with a heavily backed corporate loan from his international bank, to legally purchase my family's entire legacy. I owned the house where I had been ignored. I owned the building where I had been humiliated. I owned absolutely everything they had ever valued. The deafening silence in the small room stretched to the breaking point before Preston finally snapped. The realization that I was now his landlord, his superior, and the absolute owner of his entire past destroyed whatever fragile sanity he had left. His face contorted into a mask of explosive, venomous rage. He lunged forward, slamming his fist down onto the acquisition papers, completely ignoring the warning glare from my security detail. "What the hell is this?" Preston screamed, his voice cracking violently under the immense weight of his own failure. "You cannot do this. You have no right to do this. This is our family property. This is our home." He pointed a shaking, accusing finger directly at my face, his chest heaving with desperate, ragged breaths. "It is not fair," he yelled, the sound echoing harshly off the dingy walls. "You stole our company. You ruined my life, and you stole our legacy. You stole everything from us." I watched Preston unravel completely, his face twisted in a dark mask of pure agony and entitlement. His shouting would have once made my heart race, terrified of his temper and my father's silent complicity. Today I felt only a profound glacial calm. I simply placed my hands flat on the scratched veneer table and leaned forward, closing the distance between us. I let the silence stretch, forcing them to sit in the suffocating reality of their new position. When I finally spoke, I deliberately lowered my voice, adopting the exact same smooth, arrogant cadence my father had used during that fateful corporate gala when he publicly discarded me. "I am not stealing anything." I stated my words precise and cold. "I am simply the visionary securing modern assets, Preston. The market shifted and you failed to adapt. It is just business." The color drained entirely from my brother's face as he recognized his own toxic philosophy being fed directly back to him. He opened his mouth to argue, but the absolute finality in my eyes stopped him cold. He was looking at a woman who held the deed to his entire life. I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out 2 thick manila envelopes. They were the exact same severance packages they had thrown at my feet months ago. I slid one envelope toward Preston and the other toward my father. "Take the buyout and go," I told them, my voice entirely devoid of sympathy. "Inside you will find a standardized severance agreement. It is barely enough to secure a modest apartment in the suburbs, but it is far more than you offered me when you fired me. In exchange for this final payout, you will sign a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement and a permanent restraining order. You will never contact me, my executives, or any subsidiary of my holding company ever again." Preston stared at the manila envelope as if it were a venomous snake. He was paralyzed, unable to comprehend the sheer magnitude of his defeat. But my father, Charles, was a different kind of desperate. The cold corporate titan vanished, replaced entirely by a pathetic, trembling man who realized his legacy had just been legally erased. He ignored the severance package in front of him and looked up at me with watering, pleading eyes. "Josephine, please," Charles whispered, his voice cracking with manufactured emotion. He reached across the table, his fingers desperately seeking mine, but I smoothly pulled my hands back and folded them in my lap. "You cannot do this to me. I am your father. I raised you. I built this entire empire from nothing so that our family could thrive. You know deep down that this property belongs to the Miller name. We can fix this together. You are the new owner. You can hire us back as executives. We can run the company as a true family the way it was always meant to be." I looked at the man who had spent 3 decades making me feel utterly invisible. I saw the desperate manipulation swimming in his eyes, the exact same manipulation he had used to control my brother and me for my entire existence. He actually believed that biological proximity entitled him to a second chance. He believed that the title of father would magically erase 8 years of relentless professional exploitation and public humiliation. "We do not share an empire, Charles," I replied, deliberately refusing to use his paternal title. "We share a genetic coincidence, and that is where our connection permanently ends. You did not raise me to thrive. You raised me to be a convenient, disposable tool for your own ambition. You kept me in the shadows because you were terrified that a woman might be the smartest person in your boardroom. You handed my entire life's work to an incompetent amateur because your arrogant pride mattered more than actual competence. You gambled away the family legacy on a fraudulent bridge loan, and you lost." Charles physically recoiled, sinking deep into his cheap vinyl chair as the brutal, undeniable truth washed over him. I did not give him a chance to formulate another pathetic excuse. "Do not ever try to appeal to me as a father," I continued, my voice ringing with absolute ironclad authority. "A real father protects his children. You threw me to the wolves the second you thought you had a better deal. These documents establish a permanent, impenetrable legal boundary between us. If you refuse to sign the severance agreement today, my attorneys will immediately withdraw the offer. You will walk out of this dingy office with absolutely nothing, and you will spend the rest of your life dealing with the aggressive debt collectors you unleashed on yourselves. The choice is entirely yours, but the discussion is permanently over." I did not wait for them to respond. I simply stood up from the scratched table, smoothed the front of my tailored navy suit, and turned my back on them. My elite legal team parted seamlessly, creating a clear, unobstructed path to the heavy wooden door. As I walked out of the cramped bankruptcy office, I heard the faint, defeated sound of a pen scratching against paper. They were signing the documents. They were taking the pennies I had offered, cementing their total surrender. I walked down the hallway and stepped out into the freezing New York winter, but I had never felt warmer. 6 months later, the transition was fully complete. The massive glass structure in downtown Manhattan no longer bore the Miller family name. The golden letters had been stripped from the marble lobby and replaced with the sleek modern logo of my new holding company. I had retained the employees who actually did the hard work, and I had personally overseen the comprehensive restructuring of our international assets. The billion-dollar partnership with Mr. Saito had flourished beyond our initial projections, solidifying my position as one of the most powerful corporate executives in the city. I stepped out onto the expansive private balcony of my corner office, the very same office where my father had once plotted his ruthless acquisitions. The evening air was cool and crisp, carrying the electric hum of the city below. The setting sun cast a brilliant, fiery glow across the Manhattan skyline, illuminating the towering skyscrapers in shades of gold and deep amber. I walked to the edge of the glass railing and rested my hands against the cool metal. I looked down at the endless sea of moving cars and rushing pedestrians. I had not just survived the toxic family that tried to erase my existence. I had outsmarted them, legally absorbed their fractured empire, and meticulously rebuilt it from the ground up. I did not rely on unearned privilege. I relied on my own intellect, my own strategic patience, and my own dedication. The little girl who hid in the shadows of the Connecticut estate was gone forever. In her place stood a strong woman who controlled her own destiny. I took a slow, deep breath of the evening air, savoring the absolute stillness of my new reality. There were no more voices telling me I was not good enough. The world stretched out before me, vast, beautiful, and entirely mine. I stood alone at the absolute top of an empire I had built with my own two hands, and for the very first time in my entire life, I was finally home. What happened taught me that competence does not become less real because the people closest to you refuse to acknowledge it. For years, I confused endurance with loyalty and silence with professionalism. I believed that if I worked harder, repaired one more crisis, or accepted one more humiliation, my family would eventually recognize my value. They never did. My life changed only when I stopped making their approval the condition for my future. Independence was not simply a larger title or control of valuable assets. It was the ability to choose relationships built on mutual respect, to set boundaries without apologizing, and to walk away from systems that depended on keeping me small. Blood may explain where a person comes from, but trust, protection, and accountability determine who deserves a place in that person's life. The deepest victory was not watching Miller Holdings collapse. It was realizing that I no longer needed its survival or destruction to define me. I had built a career, a community, and a sense of self that could stand without the Miller name. Sometimes the strongest foundation begins at the moment you refuse to carry a structure that was designed to crush you. Have you ever had to redefine what family means to you, or proven your worth to those who doubted you? Share your own story of resilience in the comments below, and please hit the like button and subscribe for more journeys of self-discovery and triumph.